At the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, the Mediterranean world was divided between two universes, as distinct as they were fascinating, seemingly destined to collide. On one side stood Greece, fragmented into dozens of city-states, which, although sharing a common language, similar religious traditions, and a sense of cultural identity, were immersed in fierce rivalries, local wars, and disputes for influence. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and many other cities coexisted within a political network that was at the same time complex and fragile, in which alliances shifted according to the convenience and ambition of each polis. On the other side rose Persia, a monumental empire that, since the reigns of Cyrus and Darius, had expanded almost uncontrollably, stretching across vast regions of Asia Minor, the Middle East, Egypt, and parts of the Indian subcontinent. This was a civilization ruled by an absolute monarch, whose authority was regarded as the direct expression of divine will, supported by an efficient administrative system and a large, diverse, and disciplined army. This opposition was not limited to a territorial or economic confrontation. Above all, it was a clash of systems, ways of thinking, ways of living, and of understanding the order of the world. While the Persians believed in centralization and the stability granted by a single sacred power, the Greeks cultivated, with all their contradictions, a political freedom that allowed diverse experiments in governance, from tyrannies and oligarchies to the more radical experiment that was beginning to take shape in Athens, democracy. Each of these models already carried internal tensions within themselves, but when placed face to face, they became incompatible ideologies that could not coexist peacefully. Beyond the political aspect, there were also deep differences in lifestyle and the organization of societies. Persia, with its wealth accumulated through the conquest of territories and control of trade routes, offered an almost luxurious vision of power, with grand palaces, lush gardens, and sumptuous ceremonies that reinforced the monarch's glory. The Greeks, on the other hand, valued austerity, discipline, and the individual pursuit of excellence, whether in war, philosophy, or sport. The concept of arete, virtue and excellence, was central to them, and this was reflected in everything, from the way they fought to the way they debated in assemblies. This meeting of cultures did not occur suddenly. Over decades, especially after the annexation of Ionia by the Persians, tensions grew. The Greek cities of Asia Minor came under the yoke of the Persian Empire, and many of them revolted, seeking help from the cities of mainland Greece. Athens, still on the rise, supported some of these uprisings, especially the Ionian revolt, which ignited the wrath of Darius, then king of the Persians. To him, that small polis dared to challenge the greatest empire on earth, something that could not go unpunished. This intervention would be the seed of what would become known as the Greco-Persian Wars, a conflict that, more than military, would be existential for both worlds. Another factor that cannot be ignored is the strategic role of the Aegean Sea and the commercial routes. The islands, straits, and ports of that region had immeasurable value, and the possession or control of these passages could mean economic supremacy over trade in the eastern Mediterranean. For the Greeks, keeping these routes free was essential for their survival. For the Persians, dominating them meant ensuring a safe corridor for their troops and a constant flow of wealth, further consolidating imperial power. It is important to understand, however, that at the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, the Greeks did not see themselves as a united people. This notion of unity would arise later, shaped precisely by external pressure. Each city-state thought of itself, its honor, its commercial interests, its internal rivalries. When Persian envoys arrived demanding submission, many cities, fearing destruction, accepted. Others, however, preferred to face an uncertain fate rather than give up what they considered essential: freedom. It was this resistant minority that triggered an unexpected process of coalition, capable of transforming a fragmented region into an opponent worthy of a colossal empire. As the decades went by, tension turned into inevitability. Greece and Persia were destined to face each other, not just for land or power, but for the affirmation of two ways of life. The Battle of Salamis, which would take place a few years later, would be the ultimate expression of this confrontation. But it all began with this initial scenario, in which one side saw territorial expansion as the guarantee of its greatness, while the other saw in resistance the chance to build its own identity. It was the beginning of one of the greatest rivalries in ancient history, a conflict that would decide the future of the Western world and whose echoes can still be felt more than 2 millennia later. To understand how the Battle of Salamis became inevitable, it is necessary to look back and grasp the construction and ambition of the Persian Empire. At the end of the 6th century and the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, Persia was consolidating itself as the greatest power the ancient world had ever seen. Cyrus the Great had laid the foundations of this immense empire, conquering lands that stretched from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, passing through Lydia and other strategic regions of Anatolia. After the death of Cyrus, Cambyses expanded the domain into Egypt, and soon after, Darius I took the throne with the mission of organizing and solidifying what had become a mosaic of peoples, cultures, languages, and traditions. Darius was not just a conqueror, he was a visionary administrator. He divided the territory into satrapies, regions governed by satraps, who reported directly to the king, ensuring that taxes, laws, and armies functioned efficiently across an empire that extended for thousands of kilometers. He also instituted a system of roads that interconnected the entire Persian realm, creating a network of communication and transport that, for the time, was almost unimaginable. This administrative structure allowed the Persian Empire to grow and prosper. However, along with order and discipline came the need to display power. Persian kings saw themselves as kings of kings, absolute rulers whose authority was granted by the gods, and any challenge to that authority was interpreted not as a simple act of resistance, but as an insult to the divine order itself. When the Greek cities of Asia Minor, under Persian control, revolted, this insult became even more serious because it was not an isolated act. Athens and Eretria, from mainland Greece, offered support to that rebellion. Although the uprising was crushed, the Greek audacity was engraved in Darius's memory. It was unthinkable that small polis would dare to challenge an empire proud of being invincible. This episode ignited the spark that would lead to the First Greco-Persian War. In 490 before Christ, Darius sent his troops to punish the Athenians, and what seemed like an easy victory ended in humiliation on the plain of Marathon. The defeat at Marathon was a deep blow to Persian pride, not only because of the military loss, but because of the psychological impact. A colossal empire had been defeated by a much smaller city. For the Persians, this was not just a lost battle, it was a warning that a fragmented people could unite when pressured. Darius, determined to avenge this affront, began planning an even greater invasion, a campaign that would erase any sign of Greek rebellion. However, his death prevented him from completing these plans. It fell to his son Xerxes to inherit not only the throne, but also the mission of destroying Greece. Xerxes, upon taking the throne, inherited not only the most powerful empire in the world, but also an open wound in Persian pride. He was a man of a different character than his father, more ambitious, more confident in his power, and perhaps more inclined to grand gestures and symbols of domination. His campaign against Greece would not be merely military. It would be a demonstration that no people, no matter how small, could resist the will of the Persian Empire. For this, Xerxes organized a preparation unprecedented in history. For years, resources were gathered, ships were built, soldiers were trained. Peoples from different parts of the empire, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Lydians, contributed men, equipment, and knowledge to form an army and a fleet so vast that accounts of the time speak of almost unbelievable numbers. One of the most impressive feats of this preparation was the construction of the famous bridge of boats over the Hellespont, which allowed the gigantic Persian force to cross from Asia into Europe without depending on individual ships for each crossing. This engineering work, made with hundreds of vessels tied side by side, was a clear symbol of what Xerxes represented, a king who, if necessary, would bend nature itself to his will. Another demonstration of his power was the excavation of a canal through Mount Athos, so that his fleet could avoid the dangerous currents of the region, a colossal work done solely to prevent a possible naval loss. Meanwhile, the Greek cities were preparing for what they saw as an inevitable storm, and even in the face of this threat, the fragmented nature of Greece continued to be an obstacle. Ancient rivalries made coalition building difficult. Only when the magnitude of the threat became clear did the Greeks begin to consider more serious alliances. Athens, in particular, under the leadership of Themistocles, understood that the only chance to resist lay at sea. Unlike the Persians, who relied on their numerical superiority and their experience on land, the Athenians decided to bet on naval strategy. The silver found in the mines of Laurium was used to build a fleet of triremes, fast vessels deadly in combat. This decision would change the course of the war. Xerxes thus marched not only with an army, but with the confidence that his empire represented destiny itself. Upon entering Greece, he believed that the confrontation would be more a demonstration of power than a real challenge. But that confidence, which seemed so unshakable, would be used against him in a way he could never have imagined. At the heart of this clash, which would culminate at Salamis, lay the opposition between overwhelming force and the cunning of a smaller people who saw freedom as something more valuable than life itself. When speaking about the Battle of Salamis, it is impossible not to go back almost a decade earlier and recall an episode that became a turning point between Greeks and Persians, the Battle of Marathon, in 490 before Christ. This confrontation, apparently simple from a military point of view, became a deep wound in the pride of the most powerful empire of the time, and one of the central causes of the colossal campaign organized years later by Xerxes. To understand Salamis, it is necessary to understand how an improbable victory by Athens triggered a domino effect that would culminate in a much larger and bloodier war. After Darius the Great crushed the Ionian Revolt, a rebellion of the Greek cities of Asia Minor against Persian rule, the situation seemed under control. However, the active participation of Athens and another smaller polis called Eretria in that conflict, offering ships and soldiers to help the rebels, was considered a direct affront to Persian power. In the mentality of a gigantic empire that brought together such diverse peoples and demanded absolute obedience, an act of defiance like this was unacceptable. Darius not only planned to punish them, but also decided that the time had come to subjugate all of Greece to Persian authority, turning those small independent cities into subjects of the Persian throne. It was in this context that the Persian king organized a military expedition destined for the heart of Greece. His first attempt, around 492 before Christ, failed due to a storm that destroyed much of the fleet off the coast of Thrace. But in 490 before Christ, the Persians were ready to try again. This time the force sent consisted of about 600 ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, an impressive contingent for a theater of war so far from the central borders of the empire. The fleet advanced through the Aegean Sea and along the way conquered or intimidated several smaller city-states. Eretria was attacked, sacked and completely destroyed, a clear warning to all other Greek polis about what would happen to those who dared to resist. Then the fleet landed on the plain of Marathon, only 40 kilometers from Athens. For the Athenians, the situation seemed desperate. Sparta, famous for its warriors, had promised help, but a religious festival prevented them from departing immediately. Alone, the Athenians managed to gather about 10,000 hoplites, heavily armed infantry soldiers, and were supported by 1,000 soldiers from the city of Plataea, a gesture of loyalty that would be remembered for centuries. Even so, they were at a severe numerical disadvantage against an army that included archers, cavalry, and light infantry from various regions of the Persian Empire. It was at this moment that courage and strategy made the difference. The Athenian command, led by Miltiades, opted for a daring tactic, a direct attack before the Persian cavalry could be disembarked in mass and organized on the plain. Instead of waiting for the enemy, the Greeks advanced quickly, covering the distance between the two lines at a speed that surprised the Persians. The impact of this charge was devastating. The hoplites, with their long spears, heavy shields, and bronze armor, broke through the Persian lines, especially on the flanks. The lighter Persian infantry could not withstand the pressure and ended up surrounded by the Greek center, resulting in a crushing defeat for Darius. The immediate consequences were impressive. About 6,400 Persians were killed against fewer than 200 casualties among the Greeks. The Persian fleet, frightened and disorganized, withdrew from the region. For Athens, that victory was much more than a military triumph. It was proof that a small city with organization and courage could resist the greatest power in the world. For Darius, however, it was an unforgivable insult. The king returned to reorganize his forces and swore revenge, promising that he would destroy Athens and enslave its inhabitants. The Battle of Marathon also brought profound psychological consequences. It gave the Greeks a new sense of collective identity. Until then, the polis saw themselves as autonomous and rival units, but that victory began to create the perception that, when united, they could face much greater forces. The episode also gave rise to a legend that would endure through the centuries, that of the soldier who, after running about 40 kilometers from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, fell dead from exhaustion after shouting, "We have won." Although many historians doubt the literal truth of this story, it became a powerful symbol of Greek resistance and determination. From the Persian perspective, however, Marathon was not the end of the war, but only the beginning. Darius immediately began preparing a much larger invasion, which would involve both land forces and a colossal fleet. But before he could complete his plans, he died in 486 before Christ. Thus it was up to Xerxes to inherit the task not only of avenging his father's honor, but of fulfilling the dream of subduing Greece. With an even more ambitious personality, Xerxes would take this mission to a level of mobilization never before seen in the ancient world. He would gather peoples from all corners of the empire, build engineering works that impress to this day, and march on Greece with absolute confidence in his victory. Therefore, the Battle of Marathon must be understood as the first spark that ignited the conflict between these two worlds. Without Marathon, perhaps Salamis would never have happened. The Persian desire for revenge, combined with fear and wounded pride, turned that battlefield into a symbol, both for those who won and for those who lost. And years later, when Xerxes' ships filled the Strait of Salamis, every Persian rower knew deep down that they were also fighting to erase the humiliation of Marathon, while every Greek soldier remembered the impossible feat that had changed history. When Xerxes decided to continue his father's plan and take the war into the very heart of Greece, he did not merely want to win. He wanted to crush, subjugate, and leave an eternal mark. It was more than a military act. It was a spectacle of power. The ancient world had never witnessed such a monumental logistical effort as the one Xerxes initiated for the second invasion of Greece. For him, the failure of Darius at Marathon would not only be avenged, it would be erased from memory with a campaign that would reduce any resistance to dust. And this preparation began many years before the first Persian ship touched the waters of the Aegean Sea, with planning that involved peoples from across the empire, engineers, builders, soldiers, and resources almost beyond imagination. As soon as he ascended to the throne, Xerxes ordered a complete survey of the available forces. From the most distant satrapies came contingents of soldiers, each bringing their own style of combat, their weapons, their clothing, and their traditions. The Persian army was not homogeneous. It was a living mosaic of the empire's vast expanse. Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Indians, Lydians, Scythians, Parthians, all were summoned to form an army that seemed endless. Herodotus, the great Greek historian, speaks of more than 2 million combatants, although modern scholars debate these numbers. Even so, the most conservative estimates speak of hundreds of thousands of men, something unprecedented for that time. The organization of this mass of people required not only military discipline, but also an extraordinary logistical system. Food, water, weapons, horses, supply carts, all of it had to be transported. To move this gigantic war machine, Xerxes relied on a network of well-structured roads built since the reign of Darius, and on supplied ports to ensure that along the way the troops had constant provisions. In addition to the land army, there was also the matter of the fleet. The sea would be a crucial piece in the campaign, both for transporting soldiers and for confronting the Greek fleet. That is why the Phoenicians, considered the best sailors of the ancient world, played an essential role in the construction and command of ships. The Persian fleet was not composed solely of Persian vessels, but also included Egyptian, Cypriot, and Cilician ships, each contributing their naval expertise. From a strategic standpoint, Xerxes knew that geography could be both his ally and his enemy. The previous episode, during the first invasion, had shown that storms could annihilate a fleet in a matter of hours. To prevent that from happening again, he ordered 2 legendary engineering works. The first was the construction of an artificial canal through the isthmus of Mount Athos in northern Greece. In the previous invasion, the Persian fleet had been destroyed by a storm in that region. By opening a canal, Xerxes eliminated this danger, and demonstrated that not even nature could halt his advance. This monumental work required the excavation of several kilometers of earth, a feat that, for the time, was almost impossible to imagine. The second great feat was the construction of the bridge of boats over the Hellespont, modern-day Dardanelles. This strait separated Asia from Europe and was an obstacle for such a large army. Instead of building boats to slowly transport each part of his force, Xerxes decided to create a fixed crossing. Hundreds of ships were lined up side by side, tied with thick cables, and anchored in such a way that they could withstand the sea currents. On top of these vessels, Persian engineers laid planks, beams, and earth, creating the equivalent of a floating bridge capable of supporting the passage of men, horses, carts, and supplies. This bridge was not only practical, it was a clear symbol that the will of the King of Kings could bend even the sea. There is a famous episode told by Herodotus about this feat. On the first attempt, a storm destroyed the bridge of boats. Furious, Xerxes ordered the sea to be whipped and chained, as if to punish nature itself for defying his authority. For the Greeks, this gesture was a sign of arrogance, a demonstration of how the Persian king believed himself to be above even the gods. For the Persians, however, this act showed determination and a refusal to accept any obstacle. As the mobilization advanced, villages and towns along the way were prepared to receive this colossal flow of men. The roads were filled with soldiers wearing shining armor, carts loaded with supplies, animals carrying provisions and weapons, and ships cutting across the sea carrying more contingents. It was a demonstration of power that also had a psychological effect. Long before reaching Greece, Xerxes had already spread fear. The stories about the grandeur of this march reached the ears of the Greeks long before the first battle occurred, and many began to wonder whether it was worth resisting such an overwhelming enemy. Beyond military power, there was also a political objective. Xerxes wanted to show all the peoples within his empire, and those outside of it, that no one could challenge him with impunity. Every meter of road traveled by that immense human mass was a message. The Persian Empire was on the move, and nothing could stop it. However, what Xerxes did not know was that all this gigantism would be his greatest weakness. The size of his army made it slow, heavy, and difficult to coordinate. And later, in the narrow straits of Salamis, that slowness would be masterfully exploited by the Greeks. This monumental preparation turned the Persian invasion into the largest military campaign of the ancient world. The image of this crossing, an army that seemed endless, marching across a bridge made of boats with Xerxes seated on a golden throne supervising everything, entered history as one of the most impressive scenes ever recorded. It was the march of a confident empire that believed it could conquer not only Greece but any territory that dared to remain independent. However, behind all this grandeur lay a truth that would be revealed later. No matter how great an empire was, it could still be defeated by intelligence, courage, and the smart use of terrain. This contrast between the greatest preparation ever seen and the final fate of the Persian fleet shows how, in war, numbers do not always determine victory. When news of Xerxes' colossal preparations reached the Greek world, they brought not only fear, but also a sense of inevitability. Everyone knew that a confrontation on a scale never before seen was on its way. However, contrary to what might be expected when facing such an overwhelming threat, the first reaction of the Greek city-states was not unity, but hesitation. This was because Greece, in the early 5th century before Christ, was defined by a deep and ancient trait: political fragmentation. This fragmentation was expressed in the form of hundreds of autonomous cities, the so-called polis, each with its own interests, traditions, system of government, and, most importantly, its rivalries. It is essential to understand that these cities did not form a unified country as we conceive it today. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and many others saw themselves as independent entities, and most of the time competed against each other. Local wars were common. Commercial disputes, struggles for influence, and even cultural differences fueled this constant tension. The pride of each polis was so great that they often preferred to fight one another rather than ally against an external enemy. This lack of unity had always been one of the Greeks' weaknesses, and it was precisely this weakness that the Persian Empire tried to exploit through a policy of coercive diplomacy before moving on to open war. As Xerxes began to gather his gigantic army, He sent messengers to various Greek city-states with a clear proposal: submit to the King of Kings or face destruction. Many accepted, fearing annihilation. Smaller cities, incapable of resisting alone, opened their gates and sent earth and water as a symbol of submission. This gesture of giving earth and water was a public humiliation, recognizing Persian dominance. However, there were cities that rejected the proposal, preferring to risk destruction rather than lose their freedom. Among these cities were Athens and Sparta, two historic rivals who, for a brief moment, were forced to set aside their differences in the name of a greater goal. It was in this context that the Hellenic League was born, a hastily formed alliance born more from necessity than from any genuine sense of fraternity among the polis. The negotiations were tense. Sparta, known for its supremacy in land warfare, naturally assumed the role of military leader, while Athens, thanks to its growing naval fleet, became the main maritime force. Other cities contributed smaller contingents of soldiers and ships. Even so, not all joined. Thebes, for example, wavered between supporting the Greeks and submitting to the Persians, while other cities preferred to remain neutral, waiting to see who would emerge victorious before committing themselves. The differences between these cities went far beyond politics. Sparta represented a highly militarized, conservative, and aristocratic society focused on discipline and obedience. Athens, on the other hand, was rapidly transforming into a cultural and intellectual center where democracy was beginning to take shape, giving citizens a voice in public assemblies. These two ways of seeing the world were doomed to clash sooner or later. However, at that moment, survival required a temporary pact. The first meetings of the Hellenic League were marked by heated discussions about where to fight and how to divide responsibilities. There was also a constant fear of internal betrayals. Some leaders suspected that neutral cities might open the way for the Persians. To deal with this, a solemn oath was created. The members of the League swore to fight to the end and not abandon the common cause. This promise, though symbolic, was an important psychological factor in maintaining the minimal cohesion between such diverse cities. One of the League's strategies was to define defensive positions in strategic locations, using Greek geography to compensate for their numerical inferiority. This led to the decision to resist first at Thermopylae, a narrow pass where the Persian numerical advantage would be less useful. At the same time, the Greek fleet positioned itself at Artemisium, attempting to block the Persian fleet at sea. These two defensive lines would work together. While the small land contingent delayed the Persian advance, the navy would prevent a complete encirclement. This initial strategy, although bold, already showed that the Greeks understood they could not face the Persians in an open field. The role of Themistocles was crucial in this process. The Athenian leader, more than anyone else, understood that the sea would be the key to Greece's survival. He insisted that the Greeks prepare for a naval war, reinforcing the fleet and carefully choosing locations that favored smaller, more agile ships. This strategic vision, which not all allies understood at the time, would be what saved Greece months later at Salamis. Even so, even in the face of imminent danger, the Greek spirit of independence never completely disappeared. There were disputes over who should lead, where to fight, and how much each city should contribute. This union was in many ways artificial, sustained by necessity and fear more than by a genuine desire to fight together. But the fact is that, even so, it worked. The Hellenic League, imperfect and fragile, managed to create a minimum of coordination among such different peoples. This alliance would be tested many times throughout the Persian invasion. When the Persians burned Athens, many believed the war was lost. However, the League's structure allowed the survivors to be evacuated to Salamis and the fleet to remain active. This joint mobilization, despite being full of internal tensions, would be one of the most decisive elements for the outcome of the naval battle that followed. The episode of the formation of the Hellenic League reveals a fascinating aspect of Greek history: the ability to overcome, even if only temporarily, fierce pride and historical divisions in favor of a common goal. Without this alliance, fragile as it was, the victory at Salamis would never have been possible. And ironically, this forced union would end up being one of the factors that strengthened the idea of a broader Greek identity, a legacy that would echo for centuries. Among all the figures who stood out in this decisive moment of Greek history, None shone brighter than Themistocles. If the Greco-Persian wars gave us legendary heroes like Leonidas on land, it was in Themistocles that the destiny of Greek resistance found a brilliant architect at sea. Without his vision, his political skill and his daring, the Battle of Salamis might never have happened. And without it, Greece could have been wiped away by the Persian imperial machine. Themistocles was Athenian, the son of a modest family by the standards of the city's elite. He did not come from the traditional lines of power, which forced him from an early age to develop a rare political intelligence and an extraordinary ability to persuade, manipulate, and lead crowds. In an Athens undergoing transformation where democracy was beginning to blossom, he knew how to use this new system to stand out. Unlike aristocrats who relied on their lineage, Themistocles gained prestige through his ability to foresee problems and propose daring solutions. It was he who, after the victory at Marathon, began warning the Athenians that the Persian threat was far from over. While many were intoxicated by the euphoria of that victory, Themistocles looked to the horizon and saw the shadow of an enemy who, sooner or later, would return even stronger. He understood that the next time, the Persians would not come with a limited force, but with a colossal army and an immense fleet like never before. And it was precisely this foresight that led him to defend an innovative strategy, to invest in naval power. At a time when the Greeks still thought of war mainly in terms of heavy infantry, the phalanxes of hoplites who had triumphed at Marathon, Themistocles realized that, against a numerically superior enemy, land battles would be unsustainable. At sea, however, the odds changed. Greece had a geography full of islands, narrow straits, unpredictable currents, and winds. Smaller, more agile ships, commanded by experienced sailors, could confront much larger fleets if they managed to choose the right ground, or rather, the right waters. The opportunity to turn this idea into reality came when Athens discovered large silver reserves in the mines of Laurium. This precious metal could have been used to enrich the citizens or finance some great public project. Many advocated distributing the silver as dividends to the population. But Themistocles stood before the assembly and made a speech that would change history. He convinced the Athenians to use that wealth not for immediate gain, but to build a fleet of triremes, light, fast, and lethal vessels. This decision, taken about 10 years before Xerxes' invasion, transformed Athens into a naval power. The triremes were extraordinary ships for their time. Powered by 3 rows of oars, they were fast and highly maneuverable. Instead of relying solely on close combat, their main weapon was the bronze ram at the bow, which allowed them to strike, pierce, and sink enemy ships. This type of vessel gave the Greeks a strategic advantage. In narrow waters, where the large Persian ships had difficulty maneuvering, the triremes could attack and retreat repeatedly, destroying the opponent's numerical advantage. But the genius of Themistocles was not only in building ships. He also knew how to navigate the turbulent politics of Athens, where every decision was debated and challenged. For years he worked to strengthen the fleet, convince the citizens of the importance of naval mastery, and mentally prepare the city for what was to come. He knew that the war against Persia was inevitable, and he wanted his city to be ready. When Xerxes finally launched his invasion, Themistocles played an even more decisive role. In the formation of the Hellenic League, he was the one who most strongly defended the idea that resistance should be concentrated at sea. Even after the destruction of Athens, when many were desperate and ready to surrender, it was Themistocles who remained calm and insisted on continuing the fight. His conviction was simple. If the Greek fleet was destroyed, the war would be lost. But as long as there were ships, there was hope. His strategic vision shone in 2 fundamental moments. The first was when he suggested that the final battle be fought in the Strait of Salamis. Unlike the open sea, where the Persians could use the full size of their fleet, Salamis was a narrow corridor surrounded by islands and headlands. There, the Persian fleet would be compressed, unable to maneuver, while the Greeks could use their speed to attack and retreat. The second moment came when he devised the psychological plan that would change everything. He sent a false message to Xerxes, making him believe that the Greeks were panicked and ready to flee. Convinced that he could annihilate them at once, Xerxes advanced during the night to block them in the strait, falling exactly into the trap Themistocles had prepared. This ability to manipulate not only physical movements, but also the enemy's mind, is what makes Themistocles such an extraordinary figure. He turned disadvantage into advantage, fear into courage, and fragmentation into unity. Although he was often criticized by his contemporaries, accused of being overly ambitious, manipulative, and even arrogant, no one can deny that his intelligence was decisive for the survival of Greece. After Salamis, his reputation reached its peak. He became a symbol of cunning and planning, someone who proved that against a stronger enemy, strategy could be more powerful than brute force. His life, however, would not end in peaceful glory. Years later, he would fall into political disgrace, be exiled, and end his days in Persian lands. But none of this erased the legacy he left behind. Without Themistocles, Greece might have been conquered, and the history of the West would have taken a completely different course. Few events in the history of classical Greece had such a decisive and at the same time silent impact as the discovery and exploitation of the silver mines of Laurium in the south of Attica. Located in an arid and rocky region, these mines had existed since very ancient times, but it was at the turn of the 5th century before Christ that they acquired a historical role that would forever change the destiny of Athens and, consequently, of Western civilization. Without Laurium, there would be no fleet. Without the fleet, there would be no Salamis. And without Salamis, Greek culture might never have flourished under the freedom that allowed it to reach its greatest achievements. Around the year 483 before Christ, the Laurium mines began to produce an extraordinary volume of silver, generating unexpected wealth for the Athenian polis. At that moment, the city was recovering after years of internal tensions and the glory of Marathon, but there was still no consensus on how to use these resources. The traditional custom suggested that the profits from the mines should be distributed among the citizens, functioning as a kind of public dividend. For many, this was the natural choice. Each man would receive his share, and the money would strengthen the personal economy of hundreds of families. This proposal, however, clashed with a man who saw further than all the others, Themistocles. Unlike his political opponents, Themistocles did not see the distribution of money as a safe investment. For him, that wealth had to be transformed into something that could protect Athens from future dangers. And that danger had a very clear name: Persia. He knew that the victory at Marathon had been only a pause in the conflict, not its end. While many Athenians were convinced that the worst was over, he could already see the next storm on the horizon. More than that, he knew that next time the enemy would not make the same mistake of coming with limited forces. The next invasion would be total, and Athens needed to be prepared. It was at that moment that Themistocles made one of the boldest political proposals in Greek history. Instead of dividing the silver among the citizens, he suggested that the entire city give up that immediate benefit to finance the construction of a colossal fleet of triremes. This proposal triggered heated debates in the Athenian assembly. Many accused him of being delusional, of wanting to use public money for his own plans, and of ignoring the immediate interests of the population. However, Themistocles was a master in the art of persuasion. He used fear as an argument, reminding the Athenians that the Persians would return sooner or later, and that if they wanted to protect their families and their lands, they needed to think about the future, not the present. His proposal became even more convincing when he presented an immediate enemy as justification: Aegina, an island close to Athens that at the time was one of the city's biggest commercial rivals. Themistocles argued that a powerful fleet would not only be useful against the Persians in the future, but would immediately serve to defeat the Aeginetans and protect Athenian trade. This political strategy worked. The assembly approved the use of Laurium's silver to build around 200 triremes. This investment, apparently aimed at a regional conflict, would be what saved Greece years later. The triremes built with Laurium's silver were the key to victory at Salamis. These ships were true lethal weapons at sea, fast, agile, and able to carry more than 170 rowers, as well as soldiers and sailors. Their main distinguishing feature was the bronze ram at the prow, which, in skilled hands, turned the ship into a projectile capable of piercing the enemy's hull. In open waters, their effectiveness depended greatly on the speed and discipline of the rowers, but in narrow waters, such as those of Salamis, they became practically unstoppable against larger, heavier vessels. The process of building these ships was not only a technical feat, it was also a social project that mobilized the entire city. Shipyards were created, Wood was brought from neighboring regions, blacksmiths worked tirelessly, and thousands of citizens were trained to row. This generated a profound social transformation in Athens. Until then, political and military power had been concentrated in the aristocracy, formed by hoplites who fought on land. But with the rise of the fleet, the importance of the rower, generally a common man, poor but free, grew. For the first time, the lower classes came to play a crucial role in the city's defense. This had immense political consequences. The strengthening of the navy and the victory at Salamis opened the way for Athenian democracy to expand even further, as power now depended also on the contribution of common citizens, and not only on noble warriors. The decision to invest in the fleet also changed the mentality of Athens. Until that moment, the city had been distinguished by its culture, its emerging philosophy, and its trade. Now it became a maritime power, a city that looked at the sea not only as a source of wealth, but as a protective shield. This also helped to shape a more open and cosmopolitan identity, since the navy required constant contact with other regions, peoples, and cultures. When the Persians finally arrived, almost 10 years after the construction of this fleet, Athens was already ready to face them at sea. Even after the city was burned and taken by Xerxes' troops, the ships built with laurium silver remained intact and were gathered at Salamis. There, in those narrow waters, they became the last barrier between Greek freedom and Persian domination. The story of laurium silver is, therefore, a brilliant example of how a strategic decision, taken at the right time, can change the course of history. A natural resource that could have been spent on immediate benefits was transformed into lasting military power. And ironically, what began as a project to defeat commercial rivals ended up being the salvation of Greek civilization itself in the face of the greatest threat in its history. This episode shows that the vision of a single man, combined with the sacrifice of a people, can create the conditions for an entire future to be rewritten. When Xerxes crossed the Hellespont with his colossal force and began his march through Thrace and Thessaly toward the heart of Greece, the feeling was that nothing could stop him. The whole world seemed to bow before that endless procession of soldiers, horses, wagons, and ships, advancing like a devastating wave. Yet in the midst of this overwhelming shadow, an episode arose that would become one of the greatest symbols of resistance and courage in human history: the defense of the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where a handful of Greek warriors, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, faced the most powerful empire of the ancient world, and even though defeated, managed to achieve what seemed impossible: to delay the Persian war machine and ignite the flame that would make Salamis possible. Thermopylae was a strategic geographical point. It was a narrow corridor between the mountains and the sea, so narrow in some sections that only a few men could pass side by side. The choice of this place as a defensive line was no accident. The hastily formed Hellenic League, trying to stop the invasion, knew they had no chance of facing the Persians in open field, where the enemy's numerical superiority would be overwhelming. For this reason, they decided to use geography to their advantage. In such a narrow place, the Persian multitudes would be forced to attack in limited waves, partially neutralizing the advantage of their numbers. This strategy had a clear inspiration: to turn a handful of men into a human wall. Leonidas, king of Sparta, was chosen to lead this virtually suicidal mission. Spartan culture was centered on war and discipline, and their soldiers were trained from childhood to fight without fear of death. For them, the battlefield was the place where eternal glory could be conquered. Even knowing that death was almost certain, Leonidas accepted the mission, not as an act of desperation, but as the destiny of a warrior. Accompanied by about 300 Spartan hoplites and a few thousand allies from other cities, he went to Thermopylae determined to hold out for as long as possible. When Xerxes arrived and saw that small group blocking his path, the scene seemed absurd to him. He sent envoys to negotiate a peaceful surrender. The reply of Leonidas is one of the most famous in military history: "Come and take them," molon labe in Greek. For him, freedom was not negotiable. The battle that followed became a massacre, but not the massacre the Persians had imagined. For 2 days, the Greek ranks, protected by long spears, solid shields, and the flawless discipline of the phalanx, resisted continuous attacks. Every Persian advance crashed against a human wall that seemed unshakable. Thousands of Persians fell, and Xerxes' arrogance turned to frustration in the face of such unexpected resistance. On the second day of combat, a Greek named Ephialtes betrayed his countrymen, revealing to the Persians a secret path through the mountains that allowed them to bypass the pass and attack the defenders from the rear. When Leonidas learned of this, he understood that his position was lost. Instead of retreating, he made a decision that would become legendary. He dismissed most of the Allied troops so they could survive and remained in place only with his 300 Spartans, accompanied by some Thebans and Thespians who chose to fight to the end. They knew they were going to die, but they also knew that every hour they delayed the Persian advance could mean more time for the Greek cities to prepare their final defense. The fighting on the last day was brutal. Exhausted and surrounded, the defenders fought until their spears broke and their shields were destroyed. They went on fighting with short swords, with their hands, with anything they could use. In the end, they were all killed. But the psychological impact of this act of sacrifice was incalculable. Xerxes won the battle, yes, but at the cost of precious days and a public demonstration that not even the largest army in the world could advance without resistance. What followed was devastating. The Persians advanced south, burned Athens, and seemed invincible. But the courage of the defenders of Thermopylae spread throughout Greece like a call to arms. The story of these men was told and retold, inspiring those who were still alive not to give up. And more importantly, the delay caused by their resistance gave time for the Greek fleet to reorganize, evacuate the population, and gather in Salamis, where the navy, led by Themistocles, would prepare the decisive response. From a historical point of view, the Battle of Thermopylae was much more than a military confrontation. It was a moral shock, an example of how courage and strategy can stand against tyranny and oppression. To this day, it is studied not for its victory but for its symbolic function. A handful of men who preferred to die free than to live under the yoke of an empire. Without this episode, the naval resistance at Salamis might never have happened. The men who rode in that battle knew that a few months earlier, other men had given their lives to delay the enemy. They knew they were fighting not just for their homes, but also to honor that sacrifice. Thus, Thermopylae became a prologue to Salamis, a reminder that, even in the face of an enemy who seemed impossible to defeat, the determination to resist could change the course of history. This was the moment when the war ceased to be just a matter of survival and became a fight for freedom. After the heroic resistance at Thermopylae, Greece entered a period of almost unbearable tension. The men who had given their lives in that narrow corridor knew they were only buying time, and that precious time was used by the Greek city-states to try to organize their final defense. Even so, the Persian advance was inevitable. After breaking through on land, Xerxes' forces descended into the heart of Attica. Along the way, cities were burned, crops destroyed, and inhabitants who did not flee were massacred. Athens, the symbol of Greek freedom and of the insult that Marathon had been, was now doomed to face its greatest trial. It was in this context that one of the most painful and most strategic decisions of the entire war was made: the complete evacuation of Athens. This decision was neither easy nor consensual. To understand the drama of that moment, it is necessary to remember what it meant for a Greek of the 5th century before Christ to abandon his city. The polis was not just a physical place, it was the soul of the citizen, the essence of his identity. There was no clear distinction between the individual and the city. To give it up was for many to give up on themselves. However, Themistocles, always pragmatic and visionary, insisted on a crucial point. The true strength of Athens at that moment did not lie in its walls, but in its fleet. Debates in the assembly were heated. There were those who defended a last stand on land, even knowing that the overwhelming number of Persian soldiers would make the fight suicidal. Others, overcome by fear, spoke of surrender. But Themistocles knew that the only chance of survival lay at sea. He argued that sacrificing the city would be the only way to save its people and keep the fleet alive. After all, as long as the ships remained intact, there was hope. His reasoning was clear. It is not the stones nor the bronze of the walls that save a city. It is the men and the ships that can win back everything. With this speech, he managed to approve a full evacuation. Women, children, the elderly, and even many men were hastily transported to the island of Salamis, to Troezen and other safe regions. The city was left almost empty, except for a few old men and priests who, out of devotion or stubbornness, refused to leave. What followed was a desolate scene. Athens, once vibrant and full of life, was transformed into a ghost city. Through the streets, only the wind carried the sound of slamming doors and the hurried footsteps of the last to flee. This image of abandonment, more than any battle, was a deep psychological blow for the Athenians themselves. They were handing their homeland over to the enemy, betting everything on one last desperate plan. When Xerxes finally reached the gates of Athens, he found a practically empty city. The few who remained were massacred or enslaved, and soon after the Persians set everything on fire. Flames rose to the sky and turned temples, houses, and statues into ashes. For Xerxes, that fire was a trophy. The city that had humiliated his father at Marathon was now destroyed. For the Athenians, who watched from afar, it was a scene of pain and fury. They witnessed the destruction of the Acropolis, the collapse of their homes, and still could do nothing, except hold firmly to the oars of their ships, waiting for the right time to strike back. Despite the devastation, the evacuation achieved its main objective, to save the fleet. That fleet, made up of the triremes built years earlier with the silver from Laurium, remained intact and was taken to the Strait of Salamis. There, the Greek ships found refuge in narrow waters, ideal for their battle strategy. By sacrificing the city, the Athenians ensured that their naval power continued to exist, and it was this power that would change the outcome of the war. The psychological impact of this act of abandonment cannot be underestimated. The destruction of Athens, far from breaking Greek morale, served to strengthen it. For the Athenians, every stroke of the oar and every blow of the bronze ram in Salamis would be a response to the burning of their city. They were no longer fighting just for survival, but for revenge, for honor, and for the hope of one day rebuilding everything they had lost. This silent fury made the Greek sailors even more determined and gave the naval battle an almost personal character. Historically, the evacuation of Athens is remembered as an act of strategic courage, in which the population was able to give up everything in exchange for freedom. Contrary to what one might imagine, there was no uncontrolled panic. There was pain, yes, but there was also discipline and organization. Boats transported groups of people on constant trips, crossing the strait to safe places. Entire families stripped themselves of the little they had to save, only what really mattered, their lives and the possibility of a free future. When the last ship left Athens carrying the last refugees, something profound happened in the city's mindset. For the first time, the Athenians began to see that their strength did not lie in their walls or in the marble of their temples. It lay in the sea. This realization would be decisive not only for the rest of the war, but also for shaping the identity of Athens as a naval power in the years to come. Thus, when the first columns of smoke rose into the sky and the temples crumbled, the story of Athens did not end there. On the contrary, in the waters of Salamis the oars were already ready and revenge was approaching. The sacrifice of the city would become the seed of victory. The evacuation of Athens showed that sometimes one must lose everything to save what matters most. This painful and desperate choice prepared the ground for what would become one of the greatest and most unexpected moments in military history, the naval battle that would decide the fate of the West. When analyzing the Battle of Salamis, it becomes impossible to ignore the decisive role of the setting where it took place. More than just a stage, the Strait of Salamis worked like a silent weapon, chosen with surgical precision by Themistocles to turn the Greeks' numerical weakness into a lethal advantage. Unlike battles on open ground, where numbers and brute strength tend to prevail, naval battles depend on geography as a determining factor, and at Salamis, that factor became the dividing line between the destruction of Greece and its salvation. The Strait of Salamis is a relatively narrow maritime corridor that separates the island of Salamis from the coast of Attica. To the north, it connects to the Gulf of Corinth, while to the east, it opens into the Aegean Sea. But at its most strategic point, where the battle took place, this corridor narrows so much that large formations of ships are forced to sail almost side by side, losing their freedom to maneuver. The depth is moderate, and the irregular coastline creates small inlets, promontories, and blind spots. In open waters, a gigantic fleet has the freedom to spread out and coordinate attacks from all sides. In the strait, however, an excess of ships turns into an obstacle, as if each vessel became a barrier for the others. It was precisely this reasoning that led Themistocles to choose Salamis as the battlefield. After Athens was evacuated and burned, the Greek fleet found refuge there, where calm and narrow waters offered a temporary sanctuary. It was there that he bet everything. The strait would do the work that the number of Greek ships could not do alone. The Persian fleet was 3 or 4 times larger, made up of Phoenician, Egyptian, Cilician, and other allied ships, many of them larger and heavier than the agile Greek triremes. This power, in open waters, would have been impossible to stop. But in the narrow labyrinth of Salamis, every Persian ship was forced to fight alone, without space to form lines or encircle the enemy. Another fundamental aspect of the setting was the wind and currents in the region. The sea between Salamis and the mainland is not a calm sea. The winds, especially in the morning, create short and unstable waves that make it harder for larger and heavier ships. In addition, the sunrise in that region creates a blinding effect. The first rays hit directly into the eyes of those sailing from the east, making visibility more difficult. Themistocles knew these details well and planned the attack so that the Persians would be forced to advance against the sunlight, while the Greeks, strategically positioned, had a clear and favored view. It is also important to understand the positioning of the forces. The Greek ships were arranged close to the island's shores, protected by a kind of natural wall formed by rocks and inlets. This position made it difficult to flank them. On the other side, the Persian fleet had to line up to enter the strait, progressively losing their numerical advantage as their ships were squeezed together. The grandiosity that once inspired fear now became a burden. Themistocles also foresaw the psychological effect that this narrow space would have on the enemy. An army used to easy victories relying on its size would be forced to fight in an environment that stripped them of all freedom of movement. The deafening noise of oars, the shouts of commanders, the constant grinding of Persian hulls colliding with each other, all of this created confusion and made coordination harder. The Greek ships, smaller and lighter, could turn quickly, attack and retreat as if they were predators in a safe lair, while the Persians were trapped in a compact mass of vessels. Another geographical factor that contributed was the Greeks' familiarity with the place. Most of the sailors and rowers knew those waters, knew where the most dangerous sandbanks were, where the currents were strongest, and which points made it possible to surprise an enemy ship with a side attack. This intimacy with the maritime terrain gave the Greeks an invaluable advantage, the feeling of being at home while forcing the enemy to fight in an unfamiliar maze. It is important to emphasize that the setting not only benefited the Greeks by limiting the Persians, it also served as a defensive resource in case of defeat. If the battle took a disastrous turn, the Greeks had somewhere to retreat. The shores of the island were close, allowing sailors to abandon their ships and swim to safety. For the Persians, on the other hand, retreat meant having to cross the crowded strait again, a slow and chaotic process that could turn withdrawal into disaster. Behind the choice of Salamis, therefore, there was a deep understanding of the concept of asymmetry. When one side is much weaker in numbers, it must not fight where the enemy's superiority can be fully expressed. The battle must be taken to a field where the advantages are reversed, and that was exactly what Themistocles did. He turned geography into an ally, the tide into a weapon, and Xerxes' arrogance into a trap. Salamis was not just a battlefield. It was a carefully designed plan in which every rock, every current, and every gust of wind played a role. At the moment the Persian ships began to enter that narrow corridor, their defeat was already written. The battle had not yet begun, but the setting had already been chosen to make victory change sides. After the evacuation of Athens and the strategic choice of Salamis as the decisive point of resistance, Themistocles began to prepare a plan that would become the true turning point of this war. He knew that the battle would not be won by the number of ships or by brute force, but by intelligence in using the sea as an invisible fortress. That was the essence of his vision, to turn the narrow geography into a wall that would swallow the Persian fleet, while cunning and psychological manipulation would drive Xerxes to act exactly as he wished. The plan of Themistocles was, therefore, an achievement of military strategy and psychological engineering. The first part of this plan began with something that few men, in the desperate situation the Greeks faced, would have dared to propose: forcing a decisive battle in Salamis. Until that moment, there had been a heated debate within the Hellenic League about whether they should fight there or retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth, where they could build fortifications on land and try to stop the Persians far from Attica. The commanders of the Peloponnese wanted to abandon Salamis, arguing that it would be suicidal to face the Persian fleet so close to the already devastated Athens. But Themistocles had a different vision. Retreating would mean surrendering total naval control to the Persians. He knew that if the Greeks lost command of the sea, no wall on land would be enough to stop Xerxes, as the Persian ships could simply sail around any defense and attack from the rear. He needed to force his allies to fight there, in the strait, even against their will. It was in this context that he conceived one of the boldest bluffs in military history. Themistocles sent a secret messenger, a slave named Cycernus, to the Persian camp, with a carefully planned message. The message said that the Greeks were divided and ready to flee during the night, and that if the Persians attacked immediately, they could crush the enemy fleet before it even had time to escape. In essence, Themistocles made Xerxes believe that victory was already certain and that a swift advance would capture the enemy fleet. This lie planted a seed of overconfidence in the Persian command, leading them to act recklessly. Xerxes, convinced he faced a golden opportunity to end the war once and for all, ordered his fleet to enter the strait during the night and block every possible escape route. Meanwhile, the Greeks remained in absolute silence, positioning their ships close to the shores of the island in a defensive formation. During the night, they listened to the sound of hundreds of Persian oars advancing through the strait, coming closer and closer, filling that corridor with wood, sails, and men. The Persian fleet crowded together, ship after ship, until there was no more space to maneuver. By the time dawn began to break on the horizon, the leading Persian lines were trapped inside the strait, with no room to retreat, while the rows behind continued to push forward, pressed by the order to advance. This was exactly the situation Themistocles had wanted. The second element of Themistocles' plan was the perfect timing for the attack. He knew that the geography and the winds would favor the Greeks if they waited for dawn. As the sunlight appeared behind the mountains, it struck directly into the eyes of the Persians, making it hard for them to see. The morning winds created small waves that destabilized the large Persian vessels, while the smaller and steadier Greek triremes navigated with ease. By waiting for sunrise, Themistocles made nature a silent ally. At the exact moment when the first rays of light bathed the strait and the Persian confusion became evident, the Greek triremes advanced with full force. Side by side, in a coordinated line, they charged the Persian vanguard. Their bronze-reinforced prows slammed into enemy hulls, cutting through wood like blades. Before the Persians could react, the first ships were sunk or damaged, creating even more obstacles for the lines behind. The Persian fleet, compressed and unable to maneuver, collapsed into chaos. Another crucial detail of the plan was discipline. Themistocles had trained his crews to work like a machine, row silently until the moment of the attack, and then act as one. Each Greek ship had a defined role. Every commander knew exactly when to turn, retreat, or strike. This coordination contrasted brutally with the Persian disorder, whose ships came from different regions and did not always obey the same language or the same signals. The Persian numerical advantage was turned into chaos. The psychological factor was perhaps the deadliest of all. Xerxes, seated on a golden throne atop a hill from which he could watch the battle, believed he was witnessing absolute triumph. But as he saw his ships colliding with one another, running aground, sinking, and blocking each other's way, confidence began to turn into despair. The pride of the King of Kings, fed by Themistocles' false information, had driven the fleet straight into the trap. In strategic terms, this plan represents one of the greatest achievements in military history, defeating a vastly superior adversary by using not only the terrain, but also the enemy's own mind as weapons. Themistocles turned geography into an invisible wall and deception into an invisible catapult. By the end of the day, when the waters of the strait were full of wreckage and bodies, it was clear that the sea had been stronger than any army. Salamis had become the tomb of Persian arrogance. This episode teaches something beyond war. It shows how intelligence, patience, and the reading of circumstances can defeat brute force. Themistocles not only won a battle, he proved that war is not decided solely by the number of soldiers or ships, but by the ability to see possibilities where others see only despair. Among the most extraordinary moments in all of ancient military history, few carry the same strategic and psychological weight as the ruse conceived by Themistocles on the night before the Battle of Salamis. If the Greek victory in that decisive confrontation was built on intelligence, discipline, and mastery of the environment, the final blow that placed Xerxes exactly where the Greeks wanted him came from an act of pure manipulation, the famous false message sent to the Persian king. It was not an improvisation, but the apex of a strategy forged with cold patience over months, based on understanding human weaknesses, reading the character of the enemy, and using Persian pride as a weapon against itself. Themistocles knew that even after the evacuation of Athens and the destruction of the city, the Greek position was extremely fragile. Their numbers were smaller, their fleet was outnumbered, and their allies were divided. Fear spread among the cities of the Hellenic League, and many commanders wanted to abandon Salamis and retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth, where they could build a line of defense on land. This hesitation was dangerous. If the Greeks retreated and left the sea open to the Persians, Xerxes could land troops behind their lines and attack from the flank, crushing any resistance. The war would be lost before a decisive confrontation even began. Themistocles needed a masterstroke that would not only keep the Greek fleet at Salamis, but also force Xerxes to fight there, in the place where every natural condition favored the Greeks. To do this, he used an invisible weapon, psychological manipulation. He knew the temperament of the Persian king very well. Xerxes was proud, impulsive, and confident that his gigantic army was unbeatable. His campaign in Greece up to that point seemed to confirm that confidence. He had crossed the Hellespont with a bridge of boats, opened a canal through Mount Athos, won at Thermopylae, and burned Athens. His very presence had become a spectacle of power, and he believed nothing could stop him. On that decisive night, Themistocles summoned a trusted man, Sisinus, a slave who spoke the Persian language and could deliver a message without arousing suspicion. Sisinus was sent secretly to the Persian camp under the cover of darkness. His mission was to deliver a carefully crafted message. He was to tell Xerxes that the Greeks were panicking, that the Hellenic alliance was collapsing, and that many ships were preparing to desert. According to the message, if the king attacked immediately during the night, he could block the escape of the enemy ships and destroy them before dawn. This lie had two clear objectives: to make Xerxes believe in an easy victory, and to induce him to act without planning, pushing his forces hastily and disorderly into the strait. The brilliance of Themistocles lay in understanding that arrogance is a more dangerous enemy than any army. Xerxes, convinced that the message was an offer of betrayal, perhaps thinking that Themistocles himself was willing to surrender, fell into the trap without realizing it. He interpreted the warning as a unique opportunity to end the war once and for all. The idea of capturing the Greek fleet in flight was too tempting to ignore. Instead of waiting for dawn and arranging his battle line in open waters, Xerxes gave the order for the Persian fleet to move immediately during the night and enter the strait to close all escape routes. The night was marked by intense movement. Hundreds of Persian ships, with thousands of rowers, advanced silently to block every possible exit. The routes around the island of Salamis were sealed, leaving no room for any ship to escape. But in the process, the massive fleet began to pile up inside the strait. Instead of forming a broad battle line, as would have been possible in open sea, the ships were jammed into an ever narrower corridor. And thus, when the sun began to rise, the Persians were already trapped in what they believed to be a trap for the Greeks, but which was, in fact, the trap prepared for them. Meanwhile, the Greeks waited in silence. Their ships were positioned side by side, ready to strike at the right moment. The discipline of the Greeks was unshakable. No one moved, no one revealed their position, no one gave the enemy any sign that they had noticed the encirclement. When the first golden light appeared on the horizon, it did not bring Xerxes the image of enemies fleeing as he had expected. Instead, it revealed a fleet organized, prepared, and ready to attack, and it was at that exact moment that the Greeks charged. With the sound of flutes marking the rhythm, the triremes surged forward like arrows, taking advantage of the fact that the Persian ships were squeezed together and poorly positioned. The first Persian line was destroyed before it could even respond, and the strait began to fill with damaged vessels that blocked the advance of the rear lines. The Greek victory was built from this initial chaos, and all of it had its origin in that message delivered by Sisinus. The psychological impact of this maneuver was devastating for the Persians. Xerxes watched from a throne mounted on a promontory, certain that he was witnessing the triumph of his campaign. But as he saw his ships colliding, sinking, and blocking each other, his certainty turned to despair. He had been deceived. His greatest weapon, confidence in the overwhelming size of his fleet, had been turned into a fatal weakness. This episode is a brilliant example of how war is not won only on the physical battlefield, but also in the mental one. The message of Themistocles did not destroy ships directly, but it created the conditions for Greek ships to do so. It is a powerful reminder that, many times, a battle is decided before the first spear is thrown or the first ram strikes an enemy hull. At Salamis, a lie proved stronger than the sword. By manipulating the pride of Xerxes and using his impulsiveness against him, Themistocles managed to turn an apparently hopeless scenario into a golden opportunity. The false message was, in essence, the key that closed the door behind the Persian fleet and sealed its fate. When the first lights of dawn illuminated the Strait of Salamis on that decisive day, two worlds so different faced each other in the form of ships. The battle about to take place would not be merely a clash between two armies. It would be a collision of strategic conceptions, military cultures, and naval technologies. The numbers, the types of vessels, and even the way of fighting on each side reflected the mindset of their civilizations, and understanding these differences is essential to explain why the Greek victory was possible even against a much larger adversary. On one side stood the Persian fleet, immense and heterogeneous. Herodotus and other ancient chroniclers speak of more than 1,000 ships, with figures ranging from 1,200 to 1,300 triremes at the start of the campaign, although modern historians estimate that, due to losses in storms and in the Battle of Artemisium, this number had been reduced to around 800 or 900 vessels on the eve of Salamis. This colossal maritime force was not made up exclusively of Persians. On the contrary, it represented the diversity of the empire. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cilicians, Cypriots, and peoples from Asia Minor contributed ships and crews. Each of these contingents brought its own navigation techniques, combat styles, and traditions, which, in normal conditions, could have been a strength, but in the chaos of the strait, became a problem of coordination. On the other side, the Greek fleet was significantly smaller. The most widely accepted accounts indicate that they gathered around 370 ships, of which approximately 200 belonged to Athens, built with the wealth from the Laurian silver mines years before. There were also ships from Corinth, Sparta, Aegina, Megara, and other smaller cities. This leaner fleet, however, had a clear advantage. It was much more homogeneous. Most of the ships were of similar models, commanded by captains who spoke the same language and followed a single plan devised by Themistocles. The star of this battle was the trireme, a vessel that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering of the time. Both Greeks and Persians used this type of ship, but with subtle differences that would make a big difference. A trireme was powered by 3 rows of oars, arranged on levels, totaling about 170 rowers. In addition to them, there were sailors, archers, and hoplites on board. The main weapon of the trireme was the bronze ram on its prow, a solid structure designed to pierce and tear the hull of enemy ships. The basic strategy was to accelerate to gain enough momentum to strike the enemy's flank or stern, withdraw quickly, and if possible attack again before the opposing ship could respond. Despite using similar vessels, the fundamental difference lay in their style of combat. The Persian fleet, being much larger, relied on forming broad lines of ships, exploiting open sea space to try to surround the enemy from all sides. They had more archers on board and focused on long-range combat or direct boarding, turning naval battles into almost land skirmishes on deck. The Greeks, with smaller and lighter ships, favored maneuverability and precision. They used the tactics known as diekplus and periplus, which involved penetrating enemy lines at vulnerable points to attack the sides, or circling the enemy fleet to strike from behind. These maneuvers required coordination, discipline, and a deep knowledge of naval warfare, exactly what Themistocles had instilled in his fleet over years of training. Another aspect worth noting was the composition of the crews. While the Persians relied on crews from many regions with different languages and cultures, the Greeks had men who worked as a cohesive unit and who had more to lose, their own homes, families, and cities. This extra motivation made a crucial difference. Furthermore, the experience of Greek sailors in the waters of the Aegean was unmatched. Many of them were born on islands and grew up familiar with its currents, winds, and dangers. For them, fighting in Salamis was like fighting in their own backyard. Numerically, the proportions were daunting. For every Greek ship, there were 2 or 3 Persian ones. However, this same superiority became a disadvantage inside the strait. The Persian fleet, pushed by Themistocles' plan and the deceptive message, entered Salamis like a compact swarm, but once inside, they discovered that there was no room to use that number. Each additional ship became an obstacle for the one behind. When the Greeks attacked, the Persian ships at the rear could neither advance nor retreat, trapped in confusion. Another important factor was ship construction. Persian ships were slightly larger and more robust, designed to carry large contingents of soldiers. But this also meant they were less maneuverable in narrow spaces. Greek triremes, on the other hand, were more agile and lighter, built for speed and precision. The difference became clear when the first clashes began. The Greek prows sliced through the waters like blades, striking enemy hulls and retreating before any counterattack could be organized. Many Persian vessels couldn't even line up properly before being struck. The Battle of Salamis thus became a living demonstration of how quality and strategy can overcome quantity. The numbers, once Xerxes' greatest advantage, became a burden. His ships, which were meant to surround and destroy, became paralyzed. The Greeks, smaller and faster, delivered surgical blows. Every sunken vessel created a barrier that further hindered the Persians, and by the end of the day, it was clear that numerical superiority was worthless without the ability to use it effectively. This disparity of forces, more than just a historical fact, symbolizes a broader concept: the struggle of a small, cohesive, determined, and disciplined group against a vast, disorganized mass. The Greek fleet represented refined strategy, awareness of the environment, and unity in a moment of need. The Persian fleet represented overconfidence, brute force without direction. In the Strait of Salamis, mathematics was replaced by intelligence, and the Greek victory would be the ultimate proof that in war, numbers are not everything. The dawn of the day of the Battle of Salamis is one of those moments in history when silence precedes a storm powerful enough to change the destiny of entire civilizations. After the most tense night those Greek sailors and soldiers had ever endured, the darkness slowly began to fade, giving way to a golden light that painted the waters of the strait. It was a scene both beautiful and terrifying, because every detail of that sunrise carried the clear awareness that within a few hours, thousands of men would not live to see another day rise. The previous night had been marked by almost unbearable tension. After Themistocles sent the false message, the Greeks remained in absolute silence. On the ships, no one slept. Every man stayed still, waiting, listening to the sounds coming from outside the strait. And what they heard was disturbing. The rhythmic beat of thousands of Persian oars cutting through the water, the creaking of timbers, the muffled sound of orders shouted in foreign tongues, the heavy breathing of an army that believed it was closing in on prey about to flee. These sounds, carried by the wind, made the enemy seem even larger in the darkness. Some sailors closed their eyes to try to concentrate. Others kept their heads up and stared into the night, waiting for the first light. With the first light came the most human and at the same time the most solemn ritual of that day: prayers. In Greek tradition, war was almost a sacred act, and before facing the enemy, each crew asked the gods to protect them and give them the strength to endure. On every ship, the commanders raised their hands and pronounced words that mingled courage and fear. They prayed to Athena, protector of the city, for wisdom and skill. They prayed to Poseidon, lord of the seas, to give speed to their vessels. Some sacrificed small animals right there on makeshift planks, letting the blood run into the sea as a silent offering. This moment was not only a religious act, it was also psychological. It reminded each man why he was there and what he was fighting for. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their burned cities, their wives and children who had been evacuated. They fought to prove that freedom was worth more than life itself. The positioning of the Greek ships that morning was calculated with mathematical precision. Themistocles had drawn up a plan in which each ship had to occupy an exact place, forming lines close to the shores of the island of Salamis. This formation had a clear objective: to create a solid initial barrier and at the same time keep enough space for the vessels to perform fast maneuvers. Unlike the Persian fleet, which spread in disorder and struggled to advance into the strait, the Greeks stayed motionless, organized, waiting only for the perfect moment to attack. The first lines were made up of the most experienced and resilient ships, mainly Athenians and Spartans. They would take the brunt of the first impact, endure the initial wave, and then open the way. Behind them came ships from other cities, ready to follow the same strategy. This division allowed that even if some ships were destroyed in the opening clashes, there would be a second line ready to take their place. As the light grew stronger, the sailors began to see in the distance the first silhouettes of the Persian fleet. It was a terrifying sight, endless lines of ships advancing slowly, occupying all the space the strait allowed. It was as if a wall of wood was moving toward them. At every moment, more vessels crowded in, pressing against each other, creating a congestion that worsened the deeper they went. But that slow advance, which seemed so threatening, was exactly what Themistocles wanted. He knew that the more the Persians pushed into that narrow maze, the more vulnerable they would become. The tension was so dense, it could be felt in the air. Every rower felt the weight of silence. Every commander gripped the reins of patience to avoid acting too soon. The attack had to happen at the perfect moment, not a second earlier, not a second later. Waiting, in this case, was a weapon. The Greek discipline was absolute. No one moved until the first Persian ships were so close that retreat or reorganization became impossible. Then, as the sun fully rose on the horizon, bathing the waters in light and blinding the Persians with the golden glare coming from the front, a sound broke the silence. The flutes. This signal, traditional in the Greek fleet, marked the beginning of the battle. It was as if the music were an order, and the oars began to hit the water in perfect unison. The Greek triremes glided forward as one body, fast and steady, heading straight for the enemy fleet. This was the moment when patience turned into movement and silence turned into war. That dawn at Salamis was not only the beginning of a battle, it was the result of years of preparation, sacrifice, and painful decisions. There, in the first hours of the morning, even before the hulls clashed, the Greek will was already decided. They would not retreat. The city had been lost, but the sea would be their last refuge and at the same time their last weapon. The prayers whispered in that dawn would, hours later, become victory cries that would echo for centuries. When the sound of the flutes broke the silence and the Greek triremes advanced for the first time in the clear morning of the Salamis Strait, what followed was an instant that seemed suspended in time. A narrow corridor filled with two worlds that would collide within seconds, hundreds of hulls slicing through the water in opposite directions, oars beating in cadence, and the wind carrying shouts that mingled with the salt of the sea. This first movement was, in essence, the moment when all the strategy and all the months of preparation turned into action. There was no turning back. The line between life and death had become as thin as the wooden hulls about to crash into each other. The Greek ranks, positioned close to the rocky shores of the island, began to pick up speed gradually. Every rower knew that the strength of the first strikes would determine the breach in the Persian lines. The men rowing had their muscles tense, bodies leaning forward, drops of sweat rolling down even in the cool of the morning. To the sound of flutes and the rhythm dictated by their commanders, the oars hit the water as if they were one single living machine. They did not look back, only forward, where the strait narrowed and the enemy ships came straight toward them. On the other side, the Persian fleet, pressed by its own numbers, advanced slowly and chaotically. The ships at the front were being pushed by those coming from behind. Many Persian captains shouted orders that could barely be heard amid the turmoil and the mixture of languages spoken among Phoenicians, Egyptians, Lydians, and other peoples. It was a mass of wood and men, which from afar looked like an impenetrable wall, but up close revealed itself to be confused and vulnerable. They had walked into Themistocles' trap without realizing it. The first minutes of the clash were marked by almost unbearable tension. The smaller, more agile Greek vessels glided quickly in formation, and when the first triremes reached the front line of Persian ships, the silence was broken by a sound that seemed to split the world in two. The sharp crack of bronze striking wood. The Greek prows, reinforced with bronze rams, smashed into enemy hulls with full force. Within seconds, the sea was filled with shards of wood, screams, and dark water pouring from the struck ships. This first impact opened gaps. Some Persian triremes sank immediately, others began to tilt, and at that moment, the second line of Greek ships came into action, using the spaces created to strike even deeper. The triremes maneuvered like serpents, turning their hulls sharply and ramming from the side, then pulling away for another attack before the enemy could respond. For the Persians, confusion was immediate. The ships behind kept pressing against the ones in front, creating a blockage that worsened with every second. The strait, which had seemed just a path, turned into a prison. The deafening sound of colliding hulls mixed with the snapping of broken oars, the screams of sailors trying to swim, and the shouted commands of officers attempting in vain to restore order. The sun, rising behind the mountains, shone straight into the Persians' eyes, blinding many and turning the glare on the water into a wall of light that made coordination even harder. Meanwhile, the Greeks fought as if they were part of that sea. Each commander knew exactly how to use the rocky inlets and the speed of his ship. The vessels brushed close to the shore, spun skillfully, and struck again before the heavy Persian ships could reposition. With every successful maneuver, a Persian vessel was sunk, turning into a physical and psychological obstacle. Soon, Persian ships began colliding with one another, trapped in the chaos of congestion. The battle was not fought with rams alone. As soon as Greek ships smashed into Persian hulls, the archers and hoplites on board sprang into action. A rain of arrows fell upon the enemy ships, and when the vessels came side by side, soldiers leaped aboard to fight hand to hand. The strait turned into a scene of total war. The sound of oars was replaced by the clash of spears, screams of pain, the hiss of arrows, and bodies plunging into the sea. In these opening moments, Greek tactical superiority became undeniable. While Xerxes' massive army struggled to move, the Greeks focused entirely on striking fast and withdrawing. Every successful strike sent panic through the Persian ranks. The fleet of Xerxes, which had seemed an indestructible monster, was being ripped apart piece by piece. In just a few hours, the certainty of absolute victory began to turn into irreversible chaos. For those watching from afar, and Xerxes was seated on his golden throne on a hill, observing the battle, the beginning was a shock. He expected to see the Greek ships fleeing, but what he saw was his front lines being destroyed in broad daylight. With every Persian ship that sank, the king's expression hardened, and the generals tried to reorganize their lines, but it was already too late. The trap had been sprung, and the Persians were cornered. This first impact, these opening minutes when the Greek lines broke the Persian formation, set the rhythm of the battle. From that moment on, the confrontation was no longer balanced, but became a controlled slaughter. And as the Greek ships struck like hammers against a trapped enemy, the men who had abandoned Athens and watched their city burn now found in the sea a vengeance as clear as the morning light. The strait turned into a furnace of combat. The waters were covered with wreckage. Bodies floated among overturned ships and shattered masts, and the roar of battle was heard far beyond the shores. And all of this began with a single movement, a line of Greek triremes advancing against an enemy that believed it was facing easy prey. That was the turning point of destiny. After the initial clash, when the bronze rams of the Greek triremes shattered the first Persian hulls and spread chaos through the enemy vanguard, the Battle of Salamis entered a second phase in which Themistocles' carefully devised strategy began to unfold in full. If the beginning had been a lightning strike, this stage became the cold, deliberate execution of a maneuver that suffocated the enemy, turning Xerxes' numerical superiority into his greatest weakness. With every passing minute, the Persian fleet ceased to be an organized force and turned into a disordered mass, blocked inside a labyrinth of water and wood. It was the weight of the Persian Empire collapsing on itself. Themistocles' plan relied on two complementary stages. The first consisted of forcing the Persian fleet to enter the narrow strait and lose its freedom of maneuver. The second, in applying constant pressure on the first lines, creating a bottleneck effect. When the Persian fleet became so compressed that it could neither advance nor retreat, it would be immobilized and exposed. From that moment on, the Greek ships could attack with precision, like predators in a trap. And that is exactly what happened on the morning of the battle. Right after the first impact, as Persian ships began colliding with one another and confusion spread, the Greek commanders received the signal for the maneuver. Contrary to the image of a continuous frontal assault, the Greek formation began to break into small mobile groups. These groups attacked a specific sector of the Persian line, caused a localized collapse, and before the Persian rear could reorganize, withdrew quickly to make room for another group to perform the same strike elsewhere. It was as if successive, rapid and coordinated blows were striking the Persian fleet from every side without giving it time to respond. This tactic was only possible because of the nature of the Greek triremes. Agile, light and crewed by highly disciplined rowers, they could execute tight turns within a few meters, allowing them to slip in and out of the gaps created by the disordered Persian ships. While Xerxes' vessels took long to turn or reposition, the Greeks weaved in zigzag patterns, attacking, sinking a ship and retreating before they could get trapped. With every attack, another obstacle was created in the sea: a shattered hull, a capsized ship, a fallen mast. And each obstacle transformed the strait into an increasingly hostile battlefield for the Persians. Another decisive factor was the use of the strait as a funnel. The ships deeper in the Persian rear continued to push forward, pressured by Xerxes' orders. This left the ships in front with no room to maneuver, nor to flee. Thus, with every Greek strike, the ships in the Persian line had nowhere to escape or reorganize. They were stuck, perfect targets. The blockage became so complete that at a certain point the sea looked like a mosaic of vessels jammed together, unable to move, a chaos where not even the most experienced commanders could regain control. Beyond the physical pressure, there was psychological pressure. The Persian sailors were used to winning through intimidation by numbers, but at Salamis, the more they advanced, the more they realized they were being herded into an inescapable trap. Screams of fear began replacing commands. Many Persian ships tried to back away, but were blocked by their own allies behind them. It was a domino effect of panic. And as if that wasn't enough, the sun still shone directly into the eyes of the crews, impairing visibility, while the Greeks, positioned in the shade of the coast, had a clear view. The role of the Greek commanders at that moment was exemplary. Themistocles and the other leaders knew that, even with a positional advantage, they could not give in to the impulse of chasing ships into open waters. The order was clear: keep the fight inside the strait, continue suffocating, force the enemy to fight without space. Every time a group of Persian ships tried to break through, the Greeks closed the line again, turning the sea into a corridor of death. One episode that symbolizes this moment was the destruction of several Phoenician ships, considered the elite of the Persian fleet. These ships, being larger and heavier, were top priority targets. The Greek triremes approached from different angles, struck their flanks, and then turned quickly to avoid prolonged direct combat. Within a few hours, the Phoenician fleet, supposedly the most disciplined and dangerous, was virtually annihilated. The absence of these ships opened even more space for the Greeks to advance and isolate the contingents from other regions of the empire. At the same time, the trap began to take on an almost symbolic dimension. Xerxes, positioned on a hill from where he watched the battle, began to realize that his fleet was vanishing before his eyes. He saw the ships being swallowed one by one, with nothing he could do. He tried to send orders, but it was impossible for them to reach the ships trapped in the heart of the strait. The King of Kings, used to commanding millions, was powerless in the face of the cunning of a few thousand. This suffocating maneuver not only destroyed the Persian fleet, but also crushed the morale of its soldiers. Instead of a quick, devastating victory, as Xerxes had planned, what unfolded was a slow massacre, a systematic dismantling of the fleet, as if every enemy ship was being plucked one by one, until nothing remained but wreckage. When the strait was already covered with corpses, fragments of wood and drifting ships, it was clear that the battle had been won not by strength, but by intelligence. Themistocles had used the sea as an invisible wall, and the enemy's own ranks as a trap against themselves. The Persian numerical superiority, Xerxes' greatest weapon, had been neutralized by the art of maneuver. This phase of the battle, which began with the crash of the first impacts and ended with a sea overrun by chaos, was the flawless execution of a strategy. In just a few hours, what seemed to be an uneven fight turned into a Greek triumph, proving once again that war is not only a matter of numbers, but of minds capable of turning the impossible into victory. As the Greek maneuver advanced, and the first Persian lines were torn apart by the bronze prows of the enemy triremes, something began to happen slowly and irreversibly. The Persian fleet lost control. At first, the impact seemed to be only a localized blow, a setback that could easily be compensated for by the colossal mass of ships that still stretched through the strait. But like poison spreading through a body, confusion began at the front ranks, and propagated backwards, creating a domino effect that, in a matter of hours, transformed the greatest naval force in the world into a tangle of destruction, fear, and paralysis. The Strait of Salamis had been chosen by Themistocles for this very reason. In those waters, ships had no room to maneuver freely. Every vessel had to advance in a tight line, pressed by allied ships to the left and right. This meant that any ship that was struck had nowhere to escape. When the first Persian vessels were pierced by the Greek rams and began to sink, there was no space for those behind them to retreat. They were pushed forward by the ships that came behind, and within minutes the strait turned into a corridor of collisions. A single ship in distress became an obstacle for the others, which also collided, blocking the advance. The scene became absolute chaos. The captain's shouts of command were replaced by screams of panic. Many ships collided with each other, even before reaching the Greeks. In some sections of the strait, the congestion was so severe that the ships were side by side, immobilized, trapped as if in a snare. The oars tangled and snapped like branches, and with every attempt to back up, one ship only shoved another further into the chaos. The gigantic fleet, which in open water would have been a wall, had become a disordered battlefield where Persian strength worked against itself. To make matters worse, panic began to infect the crews. Sailors and soldiers, coming from different parts of the empire, spoke different languages and fought in different ways. This made communication and the execution of orders even more difficult. While a Phoenician captain shouted for his men to advance, an Egyptian ordered retreat, and a Lydian, understanding none of these orders, just tried to keep his ship afloat. This floating Babel made each group of ships act on its own, ignoring any centralized strategy. The result was a psychological domino effect. The more confusion spread, the more men lost their calm, the more ships collided, and the greater the chaos grew. The environment also played a decisive role. Ocean currents began to drag the wreckage of the first destroyed ships, which spread through the strait like floating traps. Broken masts, oars, bodies, and chunks of wood created improvised barriers that made navigation even harder. Every ship that tried to escape became trapped in a web of obstacles. For many, the battle was no longer a fight against the Greeks, but a desperate struggle to avoid being crushed by allied ships. Meanwhile, the Greeks, with their smaller and far more disciplined fleet, continued attacking with surgical precision. With each gap opened, a new trireme entered to strike another Persian ship, then withdrew to make room for the next. It was an implacable cycle. Attack, destroy, retreat. The Greeks were in constant motion, while the Persians were trapped in immobility. There are accounts that at this critical moment, even Xerxes realized that the situation had spun out of control. From his golden throne placed on a nearby hill, he watched the spectacle of destruction, expecting at any moment to see the Greeks flee. But what he saw was a completely different picture. His ships ramming each other, his men diving into the sea to escape burning or sinking vessels, and his generals unable to restore any kind of order. The arrogance that had marked that morning turned into impotence in the face of the catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. The Phoenician ships, which were supposed to be the most feared because of their naval skill, were especially hard hit. Their larger size made them perfect targets in the narrow space, and they began to capsize one after another, blocking the strait even more and crushing any chance of reorganizing the fleet. The destruction of the Phoenicians also had a profound psychological impact. When the strongest unit of the fleet collapsed, sailors from other nations began to lose all hope. Another important factor was the sound. For those in the middle of the combat, hearing became an instrument of terror. The crash of rams against hulls, the cracking of breaking wood, the screams of men crushed or falling into the sea, and the constant banging of ships colliding created a deafening environment. This cacophony of destruction and death made it impossible for anyone to hear orders or even notice where the next attack was coming from. The Greeks, trained to fight in silence and using visual signals, turned this chaos of sound to their advantage. As the hours went by, the sea filled with corpses and floating pieces of broken ships. Many sailors, realizing their vessels were doomed, jumped into the water, trying to swim away, only to be dragged by the currents or sink under the weight of their armor. Others tried to climb aboard allied ships, only to be pushed away by their own desperate companions. What had begun as a confident, seemingly unstoppable attack by a gigantic fleet had turned into an apocalyptic scene. By the end of this process of self-destruction, What remained of the Persian fleet no longer had command or order. They were no longer fighting, they were just trying to survive. Each ship tried to find a way out, but the strait had become a closed trap. It was at this point that the battle ceased to be a confrontation and became a massacre. This absolute chaos showed the world that power lies not just in numbers, but in the ability to control one's own strength. The Persian fleet, too massive to be organized in a confined space, collapsed under the weight of its own greatness. Salamis was, above all, a lesson in how excess, when mismanaged, can become one's greatest enemy. Amid the maelstrom of the Battle of Salamis, with the sea turned into a graveyard of ships, men screaming in despair and chaos reigning supreme in the Persian fleet, a female figure emerged, as unexpectedly as she did extraordinarily. Artemisia of Halicarnassus, queen of a Greek city under Persian rule, stood out in a context where almost every story was dominated by male warriors, and paradoxically, in a confrontation that symbolized the resistance of the Greeks against the Persians, it was precisely a Greek ally of Xerxes who demonstrated one of the greatest displays of cunning and courage of that day. Artemisia was known for her political intelligence and strategic skill long before Salamis. Her city, Halicarnassus, located in Asia Minor, was a vassal of the Persian Empire, and therefore she followed Xerxes in his campaign against Greece. The queen was not a mere spectator, nor a symbolic figure on a ship. She commanded her own squadron, sailed among her sailors, and unlike most Persian commanders, had practical experience at sea. Her presence at the head of a fleet, in a world that rarely gave women any place in military roles, was already an act of boldness in itself. During the early stages of the battle, while the Persian fleet was still trying to organize itself, Artemisia was one of the few commanders who quickly realized the gravity of the situation they were entering. Seeing the vessels being compressed, the lack of room to maneuver and the clear advantage the Greeks would have in the strait, she tried to warn other commanders about the need for caution, but her words were ignored. In the heat of battle, most Persian commanders still trusted that sheer numbers would guarantee victory. Xerxes, from his throne, also believed this, and that overconfidence would be the greatest mistake of the campaign. When the first clashes began and the Persian ships piled up in a chaotic blockade, Artemisia made a bold decision that would change the course of her own story within the battle. She realized that being trapped in that bottleneck would mean certain death for both her and her crew. The Greek ships, agile and coordinated, were turning every sector of the strait into a killing ground. Without waiting for orders, she began maneuvering skillfully, trying to carve a path through the cluster of ships. It was then that a legendary episode occurred, recorded in detail by Herodotus. Chased by a Greek trireme that had identified her ship as a target, Artemisia did something unthinkable. Knowing that she had no time or space to flee, she made a radical decision. She attacked a Persian allied ship that was ahead of her. By sinking an allied vessel, she caused a moment of confusion. To the Greeks pursuing her, the scene gave the impression that her ship was, in fact, friendly, or that she might even have defected. The Greek commander, seeing Artemisia's ship sink a Persian ally, assumed she was fighting against Xerxes and abandoned the pursuit to look for another target. This maneuver, risky and ruthless, saved her life and that of her crew. The impact of this episode was so great that it reached Xerxes himself, who was watching the battle from atop the hill. Herodotus tells us that upon hearing that Artemisia had sunk a ship, the king exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." To Xerxes, that act of aggression was proof that Artemisia surpassed his generals in courage and capability. He did not know at that moment that she had attacked an allied ship, and even if he had, he would hardly have blamed her, since in the midst of that chaos, any action that destroyed a ship was seen as useful. This episode shows two things. First, Artemisia's incredible composure in a life-or-death moment. Second, how even in a colossal empire with thousands of trained men, it was a woman who made the most rational decisions under pressure. After this feat, she managed to escape the deadly congestion and lead her ship out of the line of attack, saving her squadron from destruction. In addition to this daring maneuver, Artemisia played another important role after the battle. When the destruction of the Persian fleet became inevitable, and Xerxes' advisors began to discuss the next steps, she was one of the clearest voices in suggesting that the king retreat and preserve his land forces, leaving the fleet to recover. Her opinion carried enough weight to convince Xerxes to abandon Greece and return to Asia, leaving a contingent under the command of Mardonius. In other words, not only did she survive the battle, but she also influenced the withdrawal that marked the end of Persian naval ambitions in that campaign. The story of Artemisia gained a legendary dimension because it shattered expectations and hierarchies. In a world where war was seen as an exclusively male arena, her presence on the battlefield and her intelligence amidst the chaos showed that courage and skill have no gender. At the same time, her desperate action reveals a harsh side of war, the need to make brutal choices to survive. In the context of the Battle of Salamis, Artemisia's figure is a fascinating counterpoint. While thousands of Persian ships destroyed themselves in the confusion created by Themistocles, only a few commanders had the clarity to understand what was happening, and she was among them. Her ability to escape the trap, fool an enemy, and preserve her squadron made her the only Persian commander to leave the battle with her honor intact in Xerxes' eyes. For this reason, Artemisia's name has crossed the centuries as a symbol of intelligence and bravery. In a battle that decided the future of Western civilization, she showed that, even in the midst of her side's most resounding defeat, it was possible to act with composure and turn an impossible situation into a chance of survival. As the day advanced and the sun rose high, the battle that Xerxes had imagined would be a swift and absolute triumph turned into a monumental tragedy before his very eyes. The King of Kings, seated on a luxurious throne on a hill overlooking the coast, watched the spectacle that was meant to symbolize the glory of the Persian Empire. Instead, that throne became a witness stand, and he its helpless spectator, as his fleet was annihilated. What was meant to be the coronation of his vengeance upon the Greeks had become a parade of despair, chaos, and death. From his vantage point, Xerxes had a full view of the strait. At the start of the battle, he saw his ships advancing confidently, sails billowing, oars striking the water in perfect rhythm. It was a sea that seemed endless, an unstoppable force advancing on a mere handful of Greek ships. In those first minutes, the king believed he was witnessing another inevitable victory, perhaps the final blow that would erase Athens and all of Greece from history. But as the hours passed, reality imposed itself. The ships in the front collided with one another. The congestion became increasingly visible. The Greeks, faster and more organized, broke into the lines and destroyed the ships one by one, like hunters attacking a trapped prey. What Xerxes saw next was something no Persian king had ever experienced: the disintegration of his power before his very eyes. Every Persian ship destroyed was a piece of his empire sinking into the sea. The sound of Greek prows smashing into enemy hulls reached his throne like an echo of helplessness. The sea became covered with fragments of wood, broken masts and bodies drifting. The calm waters of the strait, which at first reflected the sun like a golden mirror, were now stained red with blood and shadowed by defeat. The pride of the king was struck not only by the military disaster, but by the public spectacle of the catastrophe. Around Xerxes stood his generals, courtiers, and advisors, all forced to watch in silence as the empire, that had until then seemed invincible, collapsed. The humiliation was magnified by the fact that Xerxes himself had ordered the battle to be fought there, blindly confident in victory. The ruse of Themistocles, with the false message, had transformed confidence into a trap. At that moment, everything that the king had planned for years was disintegrating in front of his own vanity. As the Phoenician fleet was destroyed and the chain of command dissolved, Xerxes realized there was no longer a battle, only a massacre. The ships that were still intact tried to retreat, but the strait had turned into a prison. Those who attempted to escape collided with one another, and many sank without even facing an enemy. The Greeks, tireless, attacked isolated ships like wolves hunting scattered prey. In no time, the largest fleet of the ancient world had become a field of floating wreckage. Faced with this scene, Xerxes began to perceive something even more serious: the psychological impact of defeat. His fleet, which was supposed to guarantee the supply and protection of his land troops, had been destroyed. Without ships, his military campaign was compromised. The dream of conquering Greece had collapsed, and now he faced the prospect of being isolated, without supplies, in hostile territory. More than a military defeat, Salamis was a mortal blow to the prestige of the Persian Empire. For the first time in decades, the myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered. Ancient sources recount that Xerxes, confronted with this scene, lost emotional control. He tore his clothes, shouted desperate orders that reached no one, and struck his throne as if trying to punish the very earth for the betrayal the sea had inflicted upon him. The arrogance of the King of Kings had been crushed by the scenario he himself had chosen. Salamis was not just a defeat. It was a mirror showing that the Persian Empire, with all its grandeur, was vulnerable. Retreat became inevitable. Artemisia, one of the few commanders to survive the massacre, advised Xerxes to abandon Greece and save what remained of his army on land. Without his fleet, he could not sustain a prolonged campaign. Reluctant and humiliated, Xerxes accepted the counsel. In the days that followed, he ordered most of the army to return to Asia, leaving a force under Mardonius to try to resist and continue the war on land. But the offensive would never have the same strength again. The moral impact of the defeat at Salamis was too deep. The return of Xerxes was a silent and somber march. The man who had crossed the Hellespont with bridges of boats and near-divine confidence now returned to his land with the knowledge that his empire, however vast, could be defeated. His flight was not only physical, it was also symbolic. The king, who had set out to conquer an entire culture, returned carrying the memory of having been outwitted by a smaller but far more cunning enemy. The humiliation of Xerxes after Salamis echoed for years. His great armada, the pride of the empire, had been decimated. His name, once feared, was now associated with a shameful defeat. For the Greeks, this episode became an eternal symbol of resistance and hope, proof that intelligence, courage, and the defense of freedom can bring down even the mightiest of empires. With the Persian king's departure, Greece breathed easier, but it knew that the war was not yet over. However, at that moment, in the waters of Salamis, it had become clear that something had changed forever. The image of Xerxes leaving the battlefield while the sea was still filled with the remains of his fleet marked the beginning of the end of Persian ambitions in Greece. Salamis had decided not just a battle, but the fate of a war and of an entire civilization. The destruction of the Persian fleet in the Strait of Salamis was not just a naval victory. It opened an irreversible breach in the power of the Persian Empire in Greece and unleashed a chain of events that would forever change the balance of forces in the ancient world. When the last Persian ships sank or fled the strait, the consequences were already in motion. It was the beginning of the end of the greatest military campaign ever launched against Greece, and the tide of the war, until then largely in Xerxes' favor, had turned definitively. In the days that followed, the news of the disaster at Salamis spread rapidly throughout the Greek world. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The cities that had previously hesitated between submission and resistance now saw clearly that the Persian giant could be wounded. The public humiliation of the King of Kings, forced to watch the destruction of his own fleet, restored courage and determination to the Greeks. In Athens, even though the city lay in ruins, the naval victory rekindled the fighting spirit. In Sparta, where honor and military discipline were sacred, Salamis was seen as proof that collective strategy could save Hellas. For the first time, the idea of total victory seemed possible. Xerxes' withdrawal after the battle marked a strategic turning point. Without his fleet, he no longer had the means to sustain his forces in Greek territory. The Persian naval supremacy had been completely destroyed, which meant that his supply lines were compromised. Even with his colossal land army, he knew he could not risk leaving his troops isolated in hostile territory without provisions. For this reason, following Artemisia's advice, Xerxes decided to return to Asia, leaving behind a force under the command of Mardonius to try to continue the campaign on land. This decision was a silent admission that the quick victory he had promised had turned into a long and much riskier struggle. While Xerxes returned humiliated to Susa, the Greeks began preparing to face Mardonius the following year. Less than a year later, in 479 before Christ, came the two final clashes that would seal the fate of the Persian invasion, the Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Mycale. The Battle of Plataea took place on land in Boeotia and brought together a Greek army considerably larger than in previous battles, thanks to the confidence gained at Salamis. Spartans, Athenians, and other city-states united their forces into a contingent estimated at 80,000 men, against about 120,000 Persian soldiers led by Mardonius. The battle was bloody and fiercely fought, but the superiority of the hoplite phalanx, combined with the renewed motivation of the Greeks, guaranteed an overwhelming victory. Mardonius was killed on the battlefield, and the Persian front line was destroyed. Without leadership, the Persian troops retreated in disorder, marking the end of Persian ambitions on land. On the very same day, almost as if orchestrated by the gods for a symbolic finale, the Greek navy launched an attack on the Persian fleet at Mycale, off the coast of Asia Minor. Although Xerxes' fleet was already severely weakened, many surviving ships were anchored near the shore, protected by Persian soldiers. The Greeks disembarked and, in brutal hand-to-hand combat, destroyed the last remaining naval forces. Mycale was the final blow to any Persian attempt to maintain control of the Aegean. These two consecutive victories cemented the impact of Salamis. The Persian threat, which for years had hung like a shadow over the Greek cities, was finally driven away. The Persian Empire would continue to exist and remain powerful for a long time, but it would never again attempt to invade Greece on such a scale. The balance of power in the region changed forever. The immediate consequences were also political. Athens, which had sacrificed its city and staked everything on its fleet, emerged as the new naval power of the Greek world. Its leadership at sea would soon be formalized with the creation of the Delian League, a military alliance of Greek cities aimed at maintaining defense against Persia, but which would eventually serve as the foundation for the birth of the Athenian Empire. Sparta remained the great land-based power, but it was undeniable that after Salamis, Athens assumed a central role in the defense and future of Hellas. From a psychological perspective, the end of the Persian threat gave the Greeks something even more valuable than victory: confidence. For the first time, they could dream not just of resistance, but of expanding culturally, politically, and militarily. From this spirit would emerge the so-called Golden Age of Athens, a time when philosophy, art, science, and democracy flourished to an extent never before seen in history. Historically, Plataea and Mycale are often regarded as the battles that ended the Persian wars, yet it must be recognized that both were only possible because of Salamis. The naval victory orchestrated by Themistocles not only destroyed the Persian fleet, it turned the tide of the war and created the conditions for the subsequent victories to occur. Salamis broke the backbone of Xerxes' naval power and, with it, destroyed the lifeline that kept his army supplied and confident. In the end, what seemed like an unstoppable invasion ended in defeat. Xerxes returned to Asia, Mardonius was killed at Plataea, and the remaining ships were burned at Mycale. Greece was free. The cities, though different and rivalrous, proved that when united they could stand against the greatest empire in the world and prevail. And these victories, achieved one after another, would forever mark the history of the ancient world. When the echo of the final battles of the Persian wars faded, with the Greek victory on land at Plataea and the destruction of the Persian fleet at Mycale, a new chapter began in the history of the ancient world. Out of the ashes of Persian destruction and the end of the fear that had dominated Greece for decades, a transformed city emerged, Athens. Until then, Athens was just one among many city-states. It was culturally vibrant and militarily respected, but far from being the central power in Hellenic politics. Everything changed after Salamis. The sea became the arena where Athens, under the visionary leadership of Themistocles, earned the trust of all Greece and began a process that would transform it into the main naval and cultural power of the Greek world. The impact of Salamis on Athens cannot be overstated. In practical terms, the city had been devastated, houses burned, temples reduced to ashes, and the population scattered to refuges such as Salamis, Aegina, and Troezen. Yet, paradoxically, it was this very physical destruction that opened the way for a more ambitious reconstruction. More than any other polis, Athens had sacrificed everything to save Greece. This sacrifice, abandoning the city, evacuating its people, burning its own walls to keep the fleet alive, became a symbol that the Greeks would never forget. When the battles ended, everyone knew that the heart of Greek naval power now lay in the harbors of Athens. The prestige Athens gained after Salamis led in the following years many smaller cities to turn to it for protection. It was a natural choice. Sparta would remain the dominant land power, but the sea now belonged to Athens, and the sea, as Salamis had proven, was the heart of Greek defense. Thus began the formation of a new naval alliance led by Athens, aimed at protecting the Greek city-states from future Persian threats. This alliance would become known as the Delian League. The name came from the island of Delos, a place sacred to the Greeks, where the League's common treasury was established. Each allied city contributed ships, men, or tribute in money to finance the maintenance of a powerful fleet, ready to act against any sign of a new Persian invasion. Athens took the lead and became responsible for managing these resources and commanding the collective navy. What began as a defensive alliance gradually transformed into an instrument of Athenian hegemony. Thanks to the Delian League, Athens rebuilt its city more quickly than any other polis. The collected tributes financed the reconstruction of temples and walls, and the port of Piraeus became a naval center of unprecedented importance. Athens' shipyards became a machine for building triremes, ensuring that its fleet remained the most powerful in the Greek world. The discipline and experience gained at Salamis became the foundation for increasingly refined naval training, turning Athenian sailors into unmatched specialists. Furthermore, Salamis reshaped the very social structure of Athens. By showing that the fleet was as important as the hoplite infantry, the battle gave political power to the rowers, most of whom were citizens from the lower classes. These poor but free men had been essential to the naval victory, and now demanded a voice and participation in politics. This further strengthened Athenian democracy, as it gave greater influence to ordinary citizens, balancing the power of the aristocratic elites. The fleet not only defended the city, it democratized power. Politically, naval leadership gave Athens an increasingly central role in the Greek world. The Delian League began as a defensive pact, but over time became a tool for the expansion of Athenian power. The financial contributions of allies, initially voluntary, came to be strictly demanded and controlled. In many cases, cities that tried to leave the League were forced to remain by military means. In this way, Athens ceased to be merely the leader of an alliance and became what many historians consider the embryo of a true maritime empire. Culturally, the victory at Salamis and the resulting leadership opened the way for an unprecedented flowering of art and intellect. With security guaranteed at sea and resources from the League, Athens began an urban renewal process that transformed its landscape. In the following decades, monumental temples such as the Parthenon would rise, and the city would become a center of philosophy, art, theater, and science. This period, known as the Golden Age of Athens, has its roots directly in the victory at Salamis and the strengthening of the Athenian fleet. But this new power also brought new tensions. Sparta, which remained the greatest land power, looked with growing distrust at Athens' naval rise. The rivalry that had been temporarily silenced by the Persian threat would resurface in the years that followed, culminating in the Peloponnesian War. Still, in the decades immediately after the battle, Greece enjoyed a period of relative security, free from the Persian shadow, largely thanks to the naval supremacy built around Athens. In short, Salamis transformed Athens from a threatened city into a rising maritime empire. The fleet that had been forged through the sacrifice of the Laurium mines became the instrument of a new era of Greek hegemony. The city that had once been reduced to ashes by Xerxes rose from the ruins stronger than ever, and the Delian League was the expression of this rebirth. More than just a battle won, Salamis gave Athens the key to the sea, and with that key, the city opened a path that would forever change the political, military, and cultural history of the Western world. The naval victory at Salamis, beyond its strategic and military weight, generated a deep and lasting cultural impact that went far beyond the battlefield. What happened in that narrow strait in 480 before Christ was not just the defeat of a colossal fleet. It was an episode engraved into the collective consciousness of the Greeks as an eternal symbol of resistance, cunning, and the defense of freedom in the face of tyranny. This symbol crossed centuries and became an inexhaustible source of inspiration for artists, poets, playwrights, philosophers, and historians, creating a historical myth that helped shape the cultural identity of the West. Right after the battle, Athenians and other Greeks felt the need to give meaning to that event that had saved their civilization. The very idea that a city that had been abandoned and destroyed managed to rise again thanks to the strength of its fleet transformed Salamis into a foundational myth. This story was ritually celebrated at the Great Dionysia, theatrical festivals that brought together the greatest playwrights of the time. Greek theatre, which was flourishing at that moment, turned the conflict into tragedy and catharsis. One of the most notable examples of this transformation into art is the play The Persians, written by Aeschylus, who himself had witnessed the battle as a soldier. Unlike many works that only exalted Greek glory, Aeschylus chose a bold point of view, narrating the Persian defeat from the court of Susa, showing the pain, humiliation, and astonishment of the Persians at the destruction of their fleet. This approach humanized the enemy, and at the same time reinforced the idea that arrogance, hybris, leads to downfall. The play was presented in 472 before Christ, just 8 years after the battle, and was the first known dramatic work based on real historical events, marking a turning point in the history of theatre. Beyond theatre, Salamis became a recurring theme in lyric poetry. Poets such as Pindar and Simonides of Chios celebrated the heroes of the battle and immortalized the deeds of Themistocles, the Athenian sailors, and even the Spartans, who, though not present in large numbers in the fleet, represented resistance on land. These poems circulated orally and reinforced Greek identity, reminding everyone that the freedom they had won was the fruit of collective sacrifice. The battle also influenced sculpture and painting. In the years that followed, temples and public spaces in Athens were decorated with scenes representing naval battles, sailors in action, and deities associated with victory, such as Athena and Poseidon. Commemorative statues were erected, and Piraeus, the great Athenian port, became not only a naval center but also a space filled with symbols of victory. The rebuilt city proudly displayed the memory of Salamis as part of its visual identity. From a literary and philosophical perspective, Salamis came to be mentioned as a watershed in history. Herodotus, the father of history, devoted much of his work, Histories, to narrating the events that led to the battle and the strategies that defined the clash. His narrative not only documented the facts, but also consolidated Salamis as a classic example of how courage and cunning can overcome brute force. Later, philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle would use the battle as an example in discussions about politics, strategy, and the importance of unity in the face of a common threat. As centuries passed, the meaning of Salamis surpassed the simple context of the war against Persia and became an archetype. For the Greeks, it represented the victory of freedom over tyranny, of the independent polis over the crushing empire, of intelligence over arrogance. This mythified interpretation continued to be revisited throughout Antiquity and influenced generations of Roman thinkers who saw in the episode a model of resistance against any form of external oppression. Another interesting point is how Salamis helped consolidate the role of the sea in Greek mentality. Before the Persian Wars, land warfare, represented by the hoplites, was seen as the noblest form of combat. The naval victory changed this paradigm, and the figure of the sailor, the rower, and the naval commander began to occupy a place of cultural prestige. This change was reflected even in works of art, with representations of triremes and naval battles increasingly appearing on ceramics and reliefs. Centuries later, when Rome became the new power in the Mediterranean, the battle continued to be studied as a model of strategy. Roman generals saw in the genius of Themistocles an example of how to choose the right terrain and use intelligence against a numerically superior enemy. The cultural legacy of Salamis, therefore, was not limited to the Greek world. It influenced the entire Western military and cultural tradition. In the collective imagination, Salamis became a myth as powerful as the stories of the Trojan War. The difference is that, unlike the Homeric legends, Salamis was a real feat, lived by flesh and blood men, witnessed by those who would later become the chroniclers of their own glory. This blend of history and myth created a narrative that, more than a mere military episode, became an eternal symbol. Thus the battle transcended its time. It became a mirror in which the Greeks, and later the entire West, saw the values they wanted to preserve: courage, intelligence, freedom, and unity in the face of danger. The culture, art, and literature of all antiquity were marked by this heritage. Salamis, more than an event, became an epic poem written by destiny itself. The Battle of Salamis was not only a decisive clash of the Persian Wars. Over the centuries, it became a living manual of military strategy, studied by generals, statesmen, and thinkers throughout history. Every phase of this combat contains lessons that transcend time, and demonstrate how intelligence, planning, and adaptability can overcome brute force. There is no other naval confrontation in antiquity that generated as much material for strategic reflection as Salamis, because the Greek victory was not a matter of chance, but the rigorous execution of principles that remain valid even today. The first great lesson Salamis teaches is the importance of choosing the right ground, or in this case, the maritime terrain. Themistocles understood before anyone else that war should not be fought where the enemy had the freedom to exploit their greatest strength, their colossal number of ships. In open sea, the Persian fleet, numerically superior and composed of ships from all parts of the empire, could surround and crush the Greeks. For this reason, he brought the battle into a narrow strait, where every enemy vessel would become an obstacle for the others. This decision is a classic example of how to transform weakness into advantage. The Greeks could not win on the enemy's terms, so they changed the battlefield. The second lesson is patient preparation and the use of intelligence. Themistocles did not rely solely on luck or the courage of his men. For years he planned for naval war, convinced Athens to invest the silver from the Laurian mines in building a fleet, and trained his sailors to form a disciplined machine. When the battle came, his fleet was ready to act with precision. This is one of the greatest historical examples of how long-term investment and strategic vision can change the course of a conflict. Nothing that happened at Salamis would have been possible if he had not, years earlier, understood that the future war would be decided at sea. The third lesson is psychological warfare. The false message sent by Themistocles to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greeks were about to flee, is one of the greatest military bluffs ever recorded. This act not only deceived the enemy, but forced him to act hastily and disorderly, exactly as Themistocles wanted. By exploiting the arrogance of his adversary, he caused Xerxes to walk into the trap. This episode has been studied in military treatises as a way to undermine the enemy's confidence without spending a single resource. Another fundamental principle revealed by Salamis is discipline in contrast to disorganization. The Persian fleet was huge and diverse, made up of ships and crews from different regions, each with its own traditions and languages. What in theory could have been a strength through variety turned into a weakness when communication became impossible. On the other side, the Greeks, with far fewer ships, acted as one. The coordination between the sailors and the centralized command allowed orders to be followed with precision, something the enemy could never replicate. Discipline combined with training proved more powerful than numerical superiority. The battle also taught the importance of adaptation. During the confrontation, the Greeks did not insist on a single type of attack. They probed for weaknesses, opened paths, retreated when necessary, and above all knew how to use the environment, the glare of the sun, the currents, the wind, and even the debris from the first collisions, to turn the enemy's confusion into an advantage. This flexibility contrasted with Persian rigidity, which, trapped by its own grandeur, was unable to react in time. Another strategic aspect worth highlighting is how Salamis demonstrated the interdependence of land and sea. The naval victory not only saved the Greek fleet, but also ensured that land forces would not be isolated, keeping the possibilities of resistance and counterattack alive. Salamis proves that control of the sea, especially in regions made up of islands and fragmented coasts such as Greece, can determine the outcome of land campaigns. This concept would be repeated centuries later by the Romans, who, inspired by this lesson, invested in the construction of their own fleets to dominate the Mediterranean. In broader terms, the victory at Salamis solidified the idea that a war is not won only with weapons or numbers, but also with information. Knowledge of the terrain, the ability to predict the enemy's movements, and the use of psychological manipulation were as important as the bronze rams that pierced the Persian ships. This combination of elements anticipated concepts that would later be formalized in works like The Art of War by Sun Tzu and applied in modern battles. Generals throughout history continued to study Salamis. Alexander the Great analyzed it as an example of how to force the enemy to fight in unfavorable conditions. In the Roman Empire, leaders like Pompey and Caesar observed the importance of naval supremacy as a direct consequence of the lessons learned by the Greeks. Even in modern times, strategists see in Salamis a perfect case study for understanding the relationship between logistics, terrain, and psychology. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Salamis is political and moral, the importance of unity in the face of a common enemy. Greek cities that, until shortly before, had been at war with each other, managed to unite, even if only temporarily, around a greater goal. This momentary union saved Greece. Salamis showed that, even with all their internal rivalries, cohesion can turn a handful of cities into a force capable of confronting and defeating an empire that seemed invincible. In summary, Salamis was not just a battle, it was a living treaty on strategy. Every decision taken by Themistocles, every mistake made by Xerxes, and every maneuver carried out within the strait contributed to forming a set of principles that remain valid. This is why more than 2,000 years later, the Battle of Salamis is still studied as a classic example of how intelligence can defeat brute force, and how a victory achieved through cunning can change the destiny of an entire people. The Battle of Salamis, because of the epic scale of its events and the impact it had on the history of the ancient world, could not escape being recorded by the chroniclers and historians of its time. But what makes this episode fascinating is the way it was narrated by different authors over the centuries, each one offering not just a description of the facts, but also an interpretation that, combined with the others, built a mosaic of memories about this decisive confrontation. Thanks to these accounts, Salamis ceased to be just a military event and became a symbol, and it is through these sources that we know today the details that have fueled our imagination and shaped our historical understanding. The main source that offers us a detailed panorama of Salamis is Herodotus, often called the father of history. His monumental work, entitled Histories, was written only a few decades after the events and represents the first great systematic effort of historical investigation in the Western world. Herodotus was not a simple narrator. He tried to interview survivors, collect testimonies, travel through the locations, and above all to seek not only what happened, but why it happened. In his pages, we find the description of the causes of the Persian Wars, the colossal advance of Xerxes, the formation of the Hellenic League, the dilemmas faced by Themistocles, and finally, the battle itself, with a wealth of detail that would forever influence the way we understand Salamis. It is clear that Herodotus, writing in a Greece still marked by the recent memory of the Persian invasion, could not avoid a certain bias in favor of the Greeks. He praises the cunning and bravery of the Hellenes, and often portrays the Persians through the lens of arrogance and hybris, the excess that leads to downfall. Nevertheless, even with this bias, his work is one of the most precious for scholars, because it is based on direct accounts from the generation that lived through the events. Another author who contributed to building the memory of Salamis was Plutarch, one of the greatest biographers and moralists of antiquity. Writing centuries later, during the Roman era, Plutarch did not focus so much on the technical details of the battle, but on the characters, especially Themistocles. In his Life of Themistocles, he presents us with a vivid portrait of this Athenian strategist, emphasizing his intelligence, persuasion, and long-term vision. Plutarch is the one who immortalizes many of the anecdotes associated with Themistocles, such as his ability to manipulate both the Greek allies and Xerxes himself, using false letters and psychological maneuvers to lure the Persian fleet into the strait. For Plutarch, Themistocles was not just a general, he was a man capable of changing the destiny of a people with his cunning. In addition to Herodotus and Plutarch, other chroniclers and poets also left important contributions to the preservation of the memory of the battle. Aeschylus, the Athenian playwright and soldier who fought in the war, transformed the event into art with his play The Persians, staged just 8 years after the battle. Although it is a theatrical work and not a historical record, it has immeasurable value for showing how the Greeks of that time interpreted the meaning of victory as a punishment for arrogance and a triumph of freedom. Unlike other accounts, Aeschylus had the courage to narrate the tragedy from the perspective of the defeated, showing the emotional impact of the Persian defeat. Later Roman authors such as Diodorus of Sicily and Cornelius Nepos revisited the facts of Salamis, often basing themselves on Herodotus, but interpreting them through the lens of imperial Rome, which saw in the battle a classic example of how discipline, strategy, and unity could overcome brute force. For them, Salamis became a moral and military model. The accounts of these authors also preserved fascinating details of the battle. the composition of the fleets, the approximate numbers, the names of the commanders, and above all, the individual stories that otherwise would have been lost in time. It is through them that we know about the famous maneuver of Artemisia, the false message sent by Themistocles, Xerxes' reaction upon seeing his fleet destroyed, and the rituals and prayers of the Greek sailors in the dawn before the combat. Over the centuries, these accounts were constantly reinterpreted. During the Renaissance, European humanists rediscovered classical works and once again saw in Salamis a source of political and military lessons. And in modern times, historians and strategists continue to revisit these texts to understand how an event so distant in time managed to shape history. It is interesting to note that despite the differences in perspective among the authors, they all agree on one point. Salamis was an event where mind overcame force. It doesn't matter whether the account emphasizes the intelligence of Themistocles, the courage of the sailors, the arrogance of Xerxes, or the role of destiny. The central narrative always highlights that the victory was not a result of luck, but a combination of strategic vision and collective determination. Thanks to Herodotus, Plutarch, Aeschylus, and so many other chroniclers, the Battle of Salamis has not been lost to the dust of history. It remains alive not only as a military fact, but as a story of resilience, ingenuity, and courage. These texts, written more than 2,000 years ago, ensure that even today we can picture the ships crowded in the strait, hear the sound of oars beating the water, and feel the tension of that morning when the fate of the ancient world was decided. Although the Battle of Salamis was described in detail by ancient chroniclers such as Herodotus and Plutarch, modern archaeology plays a crucial role in confirming, clarifying, and in some cases correcting our understanding of what really happened in that strait in 480 before Christ. Excavations, topographic studies, and underwater explorations over the last decades have been revealing tangible evidence that gives materiality to the accounts and allows us to visualize with greater precision the scale of that historic confrontation. The first major archaeological question has always been the exact location of the clashes. Although the island of Salamis and the coast of Attica have been known since antiquity, the positioning of the fleets, the points of collision, and the escape routes were not clear. For centuries, scholars debated where exactly the Greek and Persian ships confronted each other. Recent research, combining data from marine geology, sediment analyses, and studies of the currents in the Saronic Gulf, confirmed that the Strait of Salamis was even narrower at the time of the battle than it is today. Sediments accumulated over 2,500 years have altered the coastline, but digital reconstructions made by naval archaeologists have shown how, in the 5th century before Christ, that maritime corridor was a perfect funnel for Themistocles' strategy. Another important advance came from underwater archaeology. Since the 20th century, divers and scientists have been mapping the seabed of the region, and several discoveries have helped reconstruct the battle. Fragments of wood, bronze, and pottery have been found in the areas where the ships collided most violently. Among the artifacts recovered are parts of oars, metal fittings from prows, and even pieces of weapons such as spearheads and arrowheads. These objects, although corroded by time, confirm not only the presence of intense combat in the area, but also technical details of the ships, such as the thickness of the wood used and the metallic reinforcements in the hulls. Analysis of these remains has revealed that the Greek triremes were indeed lighter and more agile than the Persian vessels, just as described in the ancient sources. Some bronze pieces found in Salamis have engravings that likely served as decoration for prows, reinforcing that these ships were not just military instruments, but also symbols of prestige and identity for the cities that built them. Archaeologists have also identified remains of shipyards near the ancient port of Athens and in Piraeus, where the Athenian fleet is believed to have been built and repaired before the battle. Shipbuilding tools, remains of docks, and launching ramps were preserved under layers of earth, revealing the industrial scale of the production of these vessels. These findings help explain how Athens was able to put to sea, in such a short time, a fleet capable of facing a numerically superior enemy. Beyond the material wreckage, the topography of Salamis also offers answers. Studies by geographers and historians, cross-referencing ancient accounts with modern bathymetric maps, have shown the probable positioning of the forces. Digital simulations indicate that the Greek fleet remained close to the island's shores, while the Persians entered from the east and, in attempting to maneuver in an increasingly narrow space, became blocked. This mapping of the scenario confirms the accuracy of the Greek strategy and explains why, once the confusion began, the Persian fleet collapsed so quickly. The evidence is not limited to the seabed. On the territory of Attica itself and the island of Salamis, fragments of helmets, breastplates, and bronze weapons have been found in areas associated with military camps. Some of these objects are now in Greek museums, such as the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, where it is possible to see the marks of impacts left by Persian weapons, a silent reminder of the violence that took place on that day. Another remarkable aspect of modern discoveries is the confirmation that the battle produced such a great impact that it left traces in the cultural landscape. In the 21st century, excavations uncovered votive offerings buried in temples rebuilt after the war, especially in Athens. These deposits include terracotta miniature triremes, broken weapons, and inscriptions dedicated to the gods, thanking them for victory. These objects show how the memory of the battle was immediately transformed into religious devotion and a symbol of collective identity. The most recent scientific investigations, using advanced technology such as high-resolution sonar and 3D scanning of the seabed, continue to reveal more details about the submerged battlefield. In some areas of the strait, unusual concentrations of wreckage have been identified, suggesting that particularly violent collisions occurred there. These discoveries allow historians and naval engineers to simulate ship movements with precision and confirm the ancient descriptions of how Persian ships became stuck against each other. The archaeological study of Salamis proves something very important: that history, even when documented by chroniclers like Herodotus, gains a new dimension when material evidence is combined with words. Each piece recovered from the seabed is a silent fragment of that morning in 480 before Christ, and when all these fragments are put together, we have not only confirmation of the accounts, but also a closer look at the physical reality of the battle. Today, more than 2 millennia later, walking along the shores of the Strait of Salamis or diving into its waters is like touching a living chapter of history. There, among stones and sand, still rest invisible remains of the ships that decided the fate of a world. These vestiges make Salamis not just a myth told in books, but a tangible place where the past still whispers through archaeology. With the end of the battles at Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale, the political landscape of Greece was profoundly and irreversibly transformed. Until then, Greece had been a mosaic of independent city-states, marked by deep rivalries, fragile alliances, and little cooperation. The Persian threat, however, brought about a fundamental change. It forced the Greek cities to cooperate as never before and gave rise to a new structure of power, centered on naval strength and on the leadership of Athens. From this moment emerged what became known as the Delian League, a military and economic pact that organized Greece as a unified bloc against Persia and at the same time opened the way for the rise of Athens as the dominant power of the Greek world. The political impact of the victory at Salamis began immediately after Xerxes' flight and the destruction of the Persian fleet. Before this episode, many Greek cities were still divided between resistance and submission. Some regions of Thessaly and Boeotia had submitted to the Persians, and even some Ionian islands had collaborated with the enemy. But the victory at Salamis, followed by the final destruction of the Persian forces at Plataea and Mycale, shattered the aura of invincibility of the King of Kings and demonstrated that unity, even temporary, could defeat the greatest empire in the world. This new reality strengthened the Greeks' confidence in their independence and created a shared awareness that military cooperation was vital. With the seas once again secure, Athens emerged as the primary naval leader of Greece. Its role at Salamis had been decisive, and this consolidated the idea that the future of Greek defense would depend on maritime dominance. Sparta remained the dominant land power with its elite hoplite army, but at sea, the leadership now belonged to Athens. This division of responsibilities between land and sea was a key factor in later alliances. It was in this context that the Delian League was born, formally established in 478 before Christ. The League brought together various Greek city-states under the promise of continuing the fight against Persia and safeguarding the Aegean Sea from any future invasion. The initial headquarters of the League was established on the sacred island of Delos, where the common treasury was kept. Each city contributed ships, men, or in some cases, tribute in money. The goal was to maintain a permanent collective fleet capable of patrolling the sea and attacking the Persians wherever they appeared. In practice, however, the League was commanded by Athens, and that meant the city began to control a large part of the financial and military resources of the entire Greek world. Over time, many cities preferred to contribute only money instead of supplying ships. This choice, seemingly practical, gave even more power to Athens, as the fleet became almost exclusively Athenian, funded by tributes collected from across Greece. This situation planted the seed of a radical political transformation. The League, which began as a voluntary defensive pact, evolved into an instrument of Athenian domination. Politically, this transformation was so deep that modern historians regard the creation of the Delian League as the beginning of the so-called Athenian Empire. With abundant resources, Athens began to build ships on an industrial scale and to rebuild its city with unprecedented grandeur. The tributes paid by its allies financed the construction of walls, temples, and a fortified port at Piraeus. This strengthening of the city was not only military, but also cultural. It marked the beginning of the flourishing that would lead to the peak of Athenian democracy and the golden age of Greece. Athens' success in leading the League also created new tensions. Sparta, which had led the battles on land, looked with increasing suspicion at the growing naval power of Athens. This rivalry between the two major Greek cities, Sparta with its rigid land discipline and Athens with its naval and cultural supremacy, would remain latent for decades and eventually erupt in the Peloponnesian War. But in the years immediately after Salamis, the necessity of maintaining unity against Persia kept that tension in check. The consolidation of the Delian League also had lasting effects on how Greece related to the outside world. For the first time, Hellas began to project power beyond its immediate borders. Naval expeditions led by Athens began not only to protect Greek territory, but also to liberate Greek cities in Asia Minor that had remained under Persian control. This marked the beginning of a more assertive foreign policy, as Greece went from defender to a power that expanded its influence using the sea as its instrument. Internally, victory and naval leadership further reinforced Athens' democratic system. The rowers of the fleet, who came from the poorest layers of society, gained more political influence, since their labor had been essential for the victory at Salamis and for maintaining maritime supremacy. This phenomenon strengthened popular participation and accelerated democratic reforms, giving a voice to classes that had previously had little influence in the affairs of the polis. Thus, Salamis not only decided a war, but also changed the way Greek city-states interacted with one another and with the outside world. The Delian League was the political crystallization of the lesson learned in the strait, that organized cooperation, when guided with vision and discipline, could transform a collection of rival cities into a force capable of confronting empires. In the years that followed, this league would become the instrument through which Athens expanded its culture, architecture, and philosophy, projecting the city's name throughout the Mediterranean. But it would also be the source of new internal conflicts. A centralized power attracted both admiration and resistance from other cities. Thus, the political consequence of Salamis was twofold. On one hand, it guaranteed the freedom of the Greeks. On the other, it ignited a struggle for power that would shape Greek history for more than a century. The Battle of Salamis was not merely a decisive moment of the Persian Wars, nor can it be reduced to a simple naval clash. The impact of that episode transcended the boundaries of the 5th century before Christ and echoed across the centuries, shaping the course of Western civilization in military, political, philosophical, and cultural aspects. The narrow strait where hundreds of triremes collided was not only a battlefield, but a place where values, ideas, and strategies were forged and preserved as examples for all future generations. The legacy of Salamis is, in essence, living proof that intelligence, unity, and courage can change the history of a people, and, by consequence, of the entire world. The first element of that legacy is the defense of freedom. When the Greeks chose to face Xerxes in the Strait of Salamis, they knew they were outnumbered, and that defeat would mean the submission of every city-state to the Persian Empire. Yet they chose to fight. That decision transformed the battle into a symbol of resistance against tyranny. It was not just a war over territory, it was a war over a way of life. The victory proved that a small but motivated and free people could overcome an empire that seemed invincible. This idea, that freedom is worth more than life itself, resonated in Greek philosophy and became one of the foundations of Western political thought. Another essential point was how Salamis redefined naval warfare and military strategy. The plan of Themistocles is studied to this day as a perfect example of how to use environment, psychology, and discipline to neutralize the enemy's numerical advantage. By choosing the strait, by deceiving Xerxes with false messages, and by executing precise maneuvers, the Greeks showed that war is not decided by force alone, but by the ability to think beyond the obvious. This lesson would be revisited by Romans, medieval commanders, and modern strategists, inspiring not only naval battles, but also land and air campaigns in completely different eras. Salamis also had lasting political consequences. Without this victory, Greece would most likely have been conquered by the Persian Empire, and institutions such as Athenian democracy would never have developed in the way we know them today. The battle not only protected the cities, but also created the conditions in which Athens could flourish and become the cradle of classical philosophy, science, and art. The Golden Age of Pericles, which later gave rise to the Parthenon, the tragedies of Sophocles, the philosophy of Socrates and Plato, and the very foundations of Western political thought, was an indirect fruit of Salamis. Without that victory in the narrow strait, the intellectual history of the West could have taken an entirely different path. Culturally, Salamis became a myth. Playwrights like Aeschylus, poets like Pindar, and historians like Herodotus immortalized the episode, transforming it not just into a historical record, but into a moral lesson. Art, sculpture, and literature turned the battle into a living symbol of unity and courage, and that symbol crossed borders and generations. Even today, the battle is remembered as one of the most important in human history, mentioned in works on strategy, philosophy, and military history. Another fundamental legacy of Salamis was the lesson about the importance of unity in the face of a common enemy. Before the Persian invasion, the Greek cities were mired in rivalries and internal wars. It was only under the threat of an overwhelming enemy that they decided to cooperate. This temporary alliance saved Greece and demonstrated that, when collective interests are placed above internal disputes, it is possible to achieve the impossible. Even though Greek unity dissolved in the following centuries, the memory of that moment continued to serve as an example for future generations. On a broader scale, Salamis is considered by many historians as one of the most important battles in world history. That is because it not only saved the Greek cities at that moment, but allowed the continuity and expansion of ideas and values that would shape the course of Western civilization. Values such as citizenship, public debate, rational thought, and political freedom had the time they needed to mature because the Persian invasion was stopped. In a world dominated by centralized empires, the survival of a small set of independent cities had a cultural impact that would spread centuries later through Rome, the Renaissance, and the modern democracies. From a military perspective, the battle also established the importance of maritime dominance in future wars. After Salamis, no Mediterranean power ever ignored the lesson that naval battles can decide entire campaigns. Control of the sea became a decisive factor for trade, security, and projection of power, and that notion began there, in that narrow strait where the Greeks turned the sea into a wall. Finally, Salamis remains, even today, a powerful reminder of how fragile great powers can be in the face of the cunning and courage of smaller peoples. Xerxes commanded the largest army and fleet ever assembled up to that point, but lost everything in a single day, because he underestimated the intelligence of his opponents. This is a lesson that transcends centuries. Overconfidence can be as fatal as weakness. The Strait of Salamis is not just a geographical location, it is a symbol. There, in a confined space, the fate of an entire civilization was decided. And the choice those men made, to confront a much larger enemy for the supreme value of freedom, continues to inspire and to teach to this very day. This is the immortal heritage of the battle, a legacy that transformed not only Greece, but the entire course of world history. When we look at the Battle of Salamis from a distance of more than 2,000 years, It is impossible not to realize that narrow naval clash, fought in Greek waters in 480 before Christ, went far beyond all dimensions of a military engagement. It was not only about deciding control over the Aegean Sea or bringing an invasion to an immediate halt. In that confined space, between rocks and waves, a confrontation of ideas, values, and ways of living took place that would forever shape the destiny of Western civilization. Salamis is, more than a military episode, a symbolic milestone where freedom faced tyranny, intelligence faced brute force, and a handful of divided cities showed the world that, when united, they could defeat an empire that seemed unshakable. That morning began with the sea mirroring the sun and ended stained with blood and scattered timbers, but behind that brutal scenery, a deep transformation was taking place. Xerxes, with his thousands of ships, believed he was only crushing yet another local resistance on his way to conquer Greece. But by bringing his fleet into the narrow waters of Salamis, he did not know that he was opening the way for a historic turning point. The strategy of Themistocles not only destroyed the Persian fleet, it destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the Persian Empire and proved that free peoples do not bow easily. This is the essence of Salamis's legacy, to prove that freedom is non-negotiable and that its defense can be achieved with cunning, discipline, and sacrifice, even when the odds seem non-existent. It was not just a dispute over territory or tribute. It was a struggle for the survival of a way of life. The city-states of Greece, each with its own form of government, culture, and tradition, shared one thing in common: their refusal to submit to a foreign central power. That collective feeling, even if temporary, was what led to the resistance at Marathon, at Thermopylae, and culminated in the victory at Salamis. Salamis is also a watershed because, by preventing Persian domination, it preserved the fertile ground for Greek culture to flourish. Without that victory, it is almost certain that Athens would have been absorbed as a mere province of the Persian Empire, and that the evolution of philosophy, science, democracy, and art would have been stifled or diverted onto entirely different paths. With the naval victory, the Greeks gained the breath they needed to rebuild their cities, reorganize their institutions, and create what would later become the foundation of Western thought. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pericles, Phidias, all of these names and their contributions exist because in that narrow strait, freedom was defended tooth and nail. From a military point of view, Salamis established principles that have never ceased to be studied. It showed that knowledge of the ground or the waters, the use of strategic deception, the ability to turn weakness into advantage, and coordinated discipline can be more effective than sheer numerical power. These concepts were applied throughout history, from Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon to modern generals. In many respects, Salamis is a practical manual of asymmetric warfare, victory through intelligence, where victory by force is impossible. The meaning of Salamis transcends Greece. There began the formation of an idea of the West based on the defense of autonomy, citizenship, and collective freedom. Although later Greek history would be marked by internal wars and political disputes, the memory of Salamis remained as a beacon, proof that even fragmented peoples can, when motivated, change the destiny of the world. That memory endured for centuries and was recalled at crucial moments of human history as an example of courage in the face of oppression. It is important to remember that victory was not without cost. Athens was in ruins, its houses burned, its temples destroyed. Families had been displaced, many had died, but from that suffering a new strength was born. Out of the ruins the Athenians rebuilt their city and over time erected works that would become eternal. Salamis was not only an end point to an invasion, it was the beginning of a new era. When one observes the long line of history, it becomes clear that if Xerxes had won at Salamis, the course of civilization might have been entirely different. Athenian democracy could have been stifled at its birth. Greek philosophy might never have flourished, and the ideas that shaped Rome, the Renaissance, and modern thought might never have emerged. Salamis, therefore, is one of those rare moments when the fate of the world revolved around the courage of a few thousand men and the intelligence of a strategist who knew how to turn almost certain defeat into victory. This is why Salamis is not just an episode of the past. It remains a universal symbol. Every time a small community stands against a giant adversary and resists in the name of its freedom, there is a distant echo of that morning in 480 before Christ. The battle that began with the sound of flutes marking the rhythm of the Greek oars has never ceased to resound in the memory of humanity. The Strait of Salamis remains there, silent, an eternal witness to the day when a handful of ships changed the course of the world. The waters that once reflected terror and blood now reflect only the light of the sun, but beneath that calm lies an immortal legacy, the certainty that as long as there is courage to resist and intelligence to act, freedom will always have a chance.